They called me the ugly high school dropout, a stain on the perfect image of my family. 10 years ago, they threw me out into the freezing winter snow with nothing but the clothes on my back, simply because I refused to take on crushing student debt to fund the medical school tuition of my golden child sister. Today, they invited me to a luxury dinner only to try and force me to sign away my last remaining piece of inheritance. They had no idea they were walking blindly into a federal sting operation, and I was the one pulling every single string behind the scenes. My name is Abby, 32 years old, and I am finally claiming what is rightfully mine. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who constantly underestimated your worth and tried to tear you down. The sharp slap of heavy paper hitting the table shattered the quiet, refined elegance of the Michelin-starred dining room in the heart of Manhattan. I did not flinch. I just stared down at the $5,000 check and the thick, intimidating stack of legal documents my mother Patricia had just thrown directly into my face. The heavy documents slid aggressively across the white linen tablecloth, knocking over a crystal water glass and soaking the edge of my napkin. "Sign it," Patricia demanded. Her voice was a harsh, venomous hiss that made the attentive sommelier at the next table pause in his tracks. Her perfectly blown-out blonde hair barely moved as she leaned aggressively across the wide table. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "You are holding up the sale of your grandmother and her massive estate, and we are not playing your petty childish games anymore. We have a massive corporate buyer offering $4 million, and we need your signature right now to release your 10% stake." I calmly picked up the check, letting the paper rest lightly in my hand. $5,000. A completely laughable fraction of what my legitimate share was actually worth. It was an outright insult poorly disguised as a generous handout. Courtney, my older sister, let out a loud, condescending sigh that echoed over the soft jazz playing in the background. She adjusted the collar of her designer silk blouse, looking every bit the picture of a highly successful 34-year-old doctor. Her posture screamed pure superiority as she looked down her nose at me. "Just take the money, Abby. It is more than generous for someone in your position. Let us be brutally honest here. A high school graduate could never earn that kind of money in a lifetime of hard work. You should be getting on your knees and thanking mom and dad for even including you in this lucrative deal. You know you always struggle with basic financial concepts." Sitting right next to Courtney was her husband, Jamal, a 35-year-old hotshot venture capitalist on Wall Street. Jamal was a wealthy African-American man who absolutely loved to flaunt his elevated social status to anyone who would look his way. He chuckled darkly, leaning back in his plush velvet chair and adjusting his flashing diamond cufflinks with an arrogant smirk. "Come on, Abby. Try to be reasonable for once in your life. Look at you. You are sitting in one of the most exclusive restaurants in the entire city, wearing a simple, cheap, off-the-rack suit. You clearly need the cash to survive. Just sign the paper, take the check, and you can go back to whatever low-paying temp job you are working these days. We have real important business to celebrate tonight, and your stubborn attitude is completely killing the mood." I set the check down on the table and looked directly at my father, William. He was slowly swirling his dry martini, avoiding my eyes, completely enabling his cruel wife and his spoiled golden child as he always did. He took a long, slow sip before setting the delicate glass down with a sharp clink against the table. "If you do not sign that contract right now," Abby William warned. He finally looked up, locking his eyes on mine with a dark, threatening glare. "I will have the restaurant security physically escort you out of the building. You do not belong at a table of elites, and I will absolutely not have you embarrass us in public. This is a private celebration for successful people." Courtney sneered, taking a delicate sip of her expensive vintage champagne. "Just like when you were 22, Abby. Always ruining things because you are too stupid to understand high finance or basic family loyalty. You have always been a heavy burden to this family. You never appreciated what we tried to do for you. They really thought they had me cornered tonight. They thought I was still that terrified, helpless 22-year-old girl they discarded like trash all those years ago. They fully expected me to cry, to beg for their approval, or to quietly submit to their relentless bullying. They thought my prolonged silence was a sign of weakness. Instead, I raised my hand and signaled the waiter. He hurried over immediately, presenting the leather-bound check presenter, containing the massive bill for the lavish dinner my family had thoroughly enjoyed long before I even arrived at the restaurant. $3,000. A ridiculous bill I knew William fully intended to force onto my shoulders as a final crushing humiliation. "I will take that," I said calmly, taking the leather book from the waiter. I reached into my purse and pulled out an obsidian black Centurion American Express card. The heavy metal card caught the dim light of the crystal chandelier overhead, reflecting a solid, undeniable truth of extreme wealth. The entire table went completely dead silent. Jamal stared intently at the black card, his mouth falling slightly open. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. That specific credit card was strictly by invitation, only requiring millions of dollars in annual spending just to qualify. It was a rare status symbol he had been desperately trying to acquire for years to prove his worth on Wall Street. I handed the heavy card to the waiter and turned my attention back to my stunned brother-in-law. I offered him a warm, pleasant smile that did not reach my eyes. "Keep your $5,000, Jamal. You are going to need every penny of it for an Uber tonight." Jamal frowned desperately, trying to maintain his arrogant, wealthy composure, but I could easily see the sudden panic setting in right behind his eyes. "What on earth are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice trembling slightly. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my sparkling water. "The bank repossessed your luxury Bentley from the valet lot exactly 10 minutes ago." The color completely drained from the face of my brother-in-law. Jamal scrambled for his expensive smartphone, his fingers violently shaking as he unlocked the screen. The arrogant Wall Street facade he wore so proudly instantly crumbled as he read through a rapid series of frantic text messages from his executive assistant. He realized in real time that his prized car was actually gone towed away by aggressive repo men right from under the nose of the restaurant valet. He started sweating profusely, his breathing growing shallow and rapid, as the terrifying reality of his collapsing financial house of cards began to sink in. Patricia slammed both of her hands violently onto the table, knocking over a silver salt shaker and rattling the expensive silverware. She completely lost her carefully crafted upper-class composure, her face turning a bright, angry shade of red. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her voice rising to a shrill, uncontrollable scream that drew the attention of several nearby tables. "I threw you out of my house 10 years ago because you were too utterly selfish to take out student loans to pay for the medical school tuition of your sister." Patricia shrieked, no longer caring who heard her venomous words. "You are a useless, ugly mistake, Abby. You have always been a massive disappointment to this family, and now you come here to ruin the most important night of our lives with your ridiculous lies." I remained perfectly calm, leaning back in my chair, and simply watching my mother completely unravel in public. After a decade of carrying the heavy weight of her cruel words, hearing her finally admit her terrible actions out loud felt incredibly vindicating. Seeing Jamal utterly humiliated and his wife on the verge of a massive public breakdown, William decided he needed to aggressively step in to save face and regain control of the narrative. He confidently reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a separate, officially sealed legal document, slamming it down right next to the check on the table. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Abby?" William sneered, his voice dripping with pure condescension. He tapped his finger aggressively against the seal of a judge. "We already went to the Supreme Court behind your back. We legally bypassed your stubborn refusal by filing a formal motion claiming you were missing and entirely mentally unfit to manage your own legal affairs." William smiled, a dark, victorious smile, reveling in the perceived brilliance of his legal theft. "A judge officially signed this order yesterday morning. We do not actually need your permission to sell the property anymore. We are forcing the estate sale tomorrow morning to a massive, incredibly wealthy real estate conglomerate called Apex Holdings for a total of $5 million in cash. You get absolutely nothing, and we get everything we deserve." Courtney let out a sharp, mocking laugh, her confidence suddenly restored by the legal document sitting on the table. "You see, Abby, you really thought you could outsmart us by paying for dinner with a fake credit card. We have a court order. We are closing the massive deal tomorrow, and Jamal is going to use the profits to expand his venture capital firm. You are entirely powerless, just like you have always been. I looked at the legal document, reading the bold text confirming the forced sale of my grandmother and her estate. I looked back up at William, then at Patricia, and finally at Courtney. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not show an ounce of the helpless fear they so desperately wanted to see in my eyes. Instead, I took another slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, set the crystal glass down, picked up the judge ruling, and started to laugh. It was not a small chuckle. It was a deep, genuine laugh that echoed across the table, completely shattering their arrogant confidence once again. William slammed his fist down his face, twisting in sudden confusion and deep anger. "What on earth is so funny?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of the moment. I slowly stopped laughing, wiping a small tear of genuine amusement from the corner of my eye. I placed the court order back down on the table and folded my hands neatly in front of me, leaning forward to look my father directly in the eyes. "Did you actually take the time to read the corporate registry for Apex Holdings before you eagerly signed this forced court order?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, commanding tone that carried the heavy weight of absolute authority. William blinked, completely taken aback by my question. "Of course I read the contract," he stammered, glancing nervously at Patricia. "They are a massive multi-million-dollar asset liquidation firm based out of Chicago. What does that have to do with anything?" Jamal, who had been staring blankly at his phone in total despair, suddenly snapped his head up. His extensive background in high finance finally kicked in, and a look of absolute terrifying realization washed over his face. He looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine fear, clearly putting the invisible puzzle pieces together in his mind. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a crisp, heavy stock business card. I casually tossed it onto the center of the table, right on top of the court order they thought was their ultimate victory. The bold, embossed gold lettering caught the light, perfectly displaying the irrefutable truth they were completely unprepared to handle. I smiled, watching the absolute horror dawn on their faces as they read the clear text printed on the card. "Abigail, founder and chief executive officer, Apex Holdings." I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the deafening silence that followed. "I hope you are ready for the closing tomorrow, William, because you are selling the estate directly to me." The silence in the private dining room became completely suffocating. I watched William slowly pick up the crisp business card from the table. His hands were shaking so violently that the heavy cardstock vibrated in his grip. He read the embossed gold lettering once, blinked rapidly, and read it again as if hoping the words would magically change. Patricia leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the text. Her jaw went slack. The aggressive red flush of anger on her face instantly drained away, replaced by a sickly pale white of pure terror. "That is impossible," Patricia whispered, her voice barely carrying across the table. "You do not have this kind of money, Abby. You are a high school dropout. You work temp jobs. This is a fake card. This is a sick, elaborate prank you planned just to hurt us." I smiled gently, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the table. "It is incredibly real, Mom. While you and Dad were busy spending the last 10 years worshipping Jamal and funding the lavish lifestyle of your perfect golden child, I was actually working. I started at the absolute bottom of a foreclosure agency, learned every single loophole in the real estate market, and built my own firm. Apex Holdings is mine. Every shell company that bid on the estate drove the price down and completely cornered you into a desperate cash sale belongs entirely to me." William dropped the card as if it had physically burned his fingers. "You manipulated the market," he gasped, clutching the lapels of his suit jacket. "You deliberately tanked the valuation of the estate. We could have gotten $8 million for that land if the buyers had not mysteriously pulled out at the last second." "You were the one who panicked, Dad," I replied coldly, my tone slicing through his pathetic defense. "You accepted a ridiculously low $5 million cash offer because you were desperate. You and Mom needed an immediate, untraceable cash closing because Jamal is currently drowning in debt and his venture capital fund is weeks away from total insolvency. You were willing to sell my grandmother and her legacy for pennies on the dollar just to bail out a man who married into this family for your retirement accounts." At the mention of his failing fund, Jamal stiffened. Courtney, however, completely lost whatever fragile grip she still had on reality. She shot up from her chair, her designer silk blouse catching the edge of her champagne flute and sending it shattering across the expensive hardwood floor. The loud crash echoed sharply, but no one even blinked. "You cannot do this!" Courtney screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "You are not taking that money. That money belongs to us. It belongs to me and Jamal. We have investors. We have a reputation to maintain. You are just a bitter, jealous little girl who wants to destroy my life because you could never be me. I am a doctor. I am the one who deserves that inheritance, not some uneducated loser who got lucky in real estate." I looked up at my older sister, feeling absolutely nothing but pity for the pathetic, entitled woman standing before me. "You are a doctor who relies on her parents to pay her mortgage, Courtney. The power dynamic has officially shifted, and screaming at me will not change the fact that I now own the very ground you plan to walk on tomorrow." Before Courtney could launch into another screaming fit, Jamal suddenly stood up. He reached out and grabbed his wife by the arm, pulling her roughly back down into her chair. "Shut up, Courtney," he hissed, his charming facade momentarily slipping to reveal the cold, calculated manipulator underneath. Jamal took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of his tailored suit jacket. When he turned his attention back to me, the panic in his eyes had been completely replaced by a smooth, predatory warmth. He walked slowly around the table, ignoring the tension radiating from William and Patricia. He stopped right beside my chair and gently placed his large hand on my shoulder. I did not flinch, though my skin crawled at his touch. "Abby," he said, his voice dropping into a rich, soothing baritone, designed to disarm and persuade. "Let us all just take a deep breath and look at the bigger picture here. I have to admit, I am incredibly impressed. You played this brilliantly. You outsmarted all of us, and that takes serious talent. You are clearly a brilliant businesswoman, and I respect that. I really do." He squeezed my shoulder lightly, leaning down so his face was close to mine. "But you have to see the massive opportunity sitting right in front of you. Apex Holdings is doing great, but it is just real estate. My firm operates on Wall Street. We handle tech startups, massive corporate mergers, the kind of aggressive capital that changes the world. We are family, Abby. Why are we fighting each other when we could be building an empire together? Inject your $5 million of capital into my venture fund. I will give you a massive equity stake, a seat on the executive board, and together we will double that money in 6 months. We can put all this ugly family drama behind us and actually win together." Jamal smiled, a perfect gleaming white smile that had undoubtedly conned dozens of naive investors out of their life savings. He truly believed he could charm me into handing over my entire fortune. He thought I was just a lonely, desperate girl craving family validation, and he was offering me the ultimate prize: acceptance. I reached up, firmly grasped his wrist, and removed his hand from my shoulder. I looked deeply into his eyes, letting him see the absolute icy void waiting for him. "Your phone is vibrating, Jamal," I noted softly. Jamal frowned, confused by the sudden change in topic. The subtle, continuous buzzing sound was coming from the inner pocket of his jacket. He reached inside and pulled out his phone. The screen was completely lit up with dozens of missed calls and a rapid stream of frantic text messages from his executive assistant. I watched the blood entirely leave his face as his eyes darted across the glowing screen. His jaw tightened, and a heavy bead of cold sweat formed on his forehead. I picked up my glass of sparkling water, took a final refreshing sip, and smiled. "I forgot to mention something earlier, Jamal. The Securities and Exchange Commission is actively raiding your Wall Street office right now. That massive internal audit proving your venture capital fund is nothing more than a giant Ponzi scheme built on stolen money. I sent the entire file to the federal agents this morning. You are completely ruined, and there is no escape. The authorities have already frozen your bank accounts, seized your corporate assets, and flagged your passport. Your empire of lies is finally over." Jamal dropped his phone onto the hardwood floor. The screen shattered instantly, reflecting the sudden and complete destruction of his entire world. The arrogant, predatory smile he wore just seconds ago vanished, replaced by a hollow, terrified stare. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking violently, as he bumped into the edge of the dining table. He opened his mouth to spin another web of charming lies, but no sound came out. The heavy reality of federal prison was crashing down on him. Before Jamal could even attempt to salvage his shattered facade, the heavy mahogany doors burst wide open. The explosive crash made everyone in the private dining room jump in shock. Aunt Brenda, the 55-year-old sister of my mother, marched directly into the room. She was panting heavily, her cheap perfume aggressively masking the stale smell of the cigarettes she constantly smoked. Flanking her on either side were two uniformed New York Police Department officers. Their hands rested casually on their duty belts, but their sharp eyes quickly scanned the tense room. "There she is!" Aunt Brenda shrieked, pointing a thick, jewel-encrusted finger directly at my face. "That is the terrible thief. Arrest her now." I remained completely seated, slowly turning my head to look at the unexpected arrivals. The sheer desperation of my toxic family was honestly becoming a masterclass in pathetic behavior. One of the police officers, a remarkably tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward and held up a firm hand to quiet Aunt Brenda. "Madam, please lower your voice immediately." "Are you Abigail?" he asked, looking directly into my eyes. I nodded once, maintaining my calm composure. "I am Abigail." "How can I help you today, officers?" Aunt Brenda absolutely refused to let the tall police officer speak again. She stole from her own mother, she screamed dramatically, clutching her chest as if she were experiencing a sudden heart attack. "She broke into the house of Patricia this morning and stole a $200,000 vintage diamond necklace from the family safe. She used that stolen money to fund her fake little shell companies. She is a dangerous criminal officer. She belongs in jail." Right on cue, Patricia and Courtney launched into a perfectly synchronized performance of absolute victimhood. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic wail, collapsing against William and burying her face in his expensive suit jacket tonight. She cried loud, heaving sobs without a single actual tear falling from her eyes. Patricia moaned loudly to the room. "How could you do this to us, Abby? We gave you everything you ever wanted, and you repay us by violently stealing my most prized possession." Courtney rushed forward, aggressively grabbing the sleeve of the second police officer. "You have to arrest her immediately," Courtney begged, her voice shaking with entirely fake terror. "She is dangerous and completely unhinged. If you arrest her for a serious felony right now, it will legally invalidate the corporate paperwork. She forced my innocent parents to sign those documents tonight. She is just a bitter high school dropout trying to con us out of our legitimate family inheritance. Please put her in tight handcuffs before she ruins our beautiful lives any further." I watched the pathetic performance unfold with quiet, detached amusement. They really thought this incredibly sloppy, desperate setup was actually going to work. They genuinely believed they could just throw a fake felony charge at me to magically erase the Apex Holdings buyout and save their collapsing financial house of cards from absolute and total permanent financial ruin forever. They needed me, locked inside a cold jail cell tonight, so they could joyfully tear up the legal contract tomorrow morning. The lead officer looked at the hysterical women, then looked back at me. He looked slightly annoyed by the dramatic screaming, but a reported grand larceny of that massive magnitude had to be taken seriously by the law. "Miss, we received a sworn official statement from your aunt, claiming she directly witnessed you leaving the private residence with the stolen property. We also received an anonymous tip that the stolen diamond necklace is currently hidden outside this restaurant. The caller claimed the necklace is locked inside the trunk of your parked vehicle." I slowly raised a single eyebrow. "A tip. Let me guess." The anonymous caller sounded exactly like my sister. The lead officer sighed heavily, his facial expression hardening into a look of serious authority. "We are going to need you to hand over your car keys right now, Abigail. And I need you to stand up, turn around, and carefully place your hands behind your back. You are being officially detained while my partner and I conduct a thorough legal search of your parked vehicle immediately, madam." William smiled broadly, a victorious grin spreading across his face. "It is over for you, Abby," he sneered. "Now you are going to federal prison, and we are keeping the estate. Have fun eating cafeteria food." I did not stand up or panic. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out my tablet, and tapped the screen. I slid the device across the table toward the officer. I would be delighted to let you search my car, I said calmly. But before you go outside, review this video feed. The officer frowned at the screen. That is a direct encrypted feed from the hidden security cameras on my car, I explained. The footage you are looking at was recorded 30 minutes ago in the parking lot. The two officers leaned over the tablet. The clear night vision footage showed a familiar figure sneaking up to my car. The figure pulled a crowbar from a bag, violently smashed the back window, and shoved a velvet jewelry box into the trunk. The officer paused the video as the figure turned toward the hidden camera lens. The streetlights illuminated the culprit perfectly. It was Aunt Brenda, the exact woman standing right here. The tall officer straightened up immediately, his expression hardening into absolute disgust. He handed the tablet back to me without a single word to my family. The second officer did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He unclipped the handcuffs from his heavy-duty belt and stepped aggressively toward the older woman. Aunt Brenda let out a high-pitched shriek as the cold metal clamped tightly around her wrists. She tried to yank her arms away, but the officer easily overpowered her, spinning her around and clicking the locks into place. You are under arrest for filing a false police report, grand larceny, fabrication, and intentional destruction of private property, the officer stated loudly, reading her rights as he forcefully marched her toward the exit of the private dining room. Brenda kicked and screamed, her cheap high heels slipping on the polished hardwood floor. She looked frantically at her sister. Patricia, do something, Brenda wailed. Tell them I was just trying to help the family. Patricia took a massive step backward, entirely abandoning her own sister to save her own skin. She pressed her hands over her mouth, refusing to make eye contact as the officers dragged a screaming Brenda out into the main restaurant, completely humiliating her in front of 100 wealthy patrons. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut, sealing the toxic woman out and leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. The reality of the situation finally shattered the delicate delusion Courtney had been clinging to all night. She stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling violently as she stared at the empty space where her aunt had just been arrested. The perfect, pristine image of the wealthy doctor she portrayed to the outside world was completely gone. Her designer silk blouse was wrinkled, her expensive makeup was slightly smudged, and her eyes were wide with genuine unhinged panic. She turned to look at Jamal. The man she thought was her golden ticket to the highest tiers of Manhattan society was currently standing near the table, sweating profusely and staring at his broken phone on the floor. "You did this," Courtney whispered, her voice shaking with building rage. She took a step toward him, her hands balling into tight fists. "You completely ruined everything, Jamal. We were supposed to be the ultimate power couple. We were supposed to be untouchable. Now my aunt is in the back of a police cruiser, and the federal government is raiding your office." Courtney raised her voice, the whisper escalating into a frantic, piercing scream. "You lied to me. You promised me a private jet lifestyle and luxury penthouses. You told me your venture capital firm was managing billions of dollars. Instead, you are just a cheap, pathetic scam artist. You drove us into massive debt to maintain a fake millionaire lifestyle, and now my family is literally falling apart because we tried to steal an estate just to bail out your worthless company." Jamal snapped his head up, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, absolute fury. The smooth, charming persona he had carefully maintained since the day they met vanished into thin air. He was completely cornered, stripped of his wealth, his status, and his freedom. He had absolutely nothing left to lose, and he was not going to go down alone. He lunged forward across the expensive rug, swiftly closing the physical distance between him and Courtney in just 2 massive strides. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip so tight she let out a sharp gasp of pain. "Shut your mouth, Courtney," Jamal roared, his deep voice vibrating through the entire room. "You think you are a victim here. You think you are some innocent princess who was tragically deceived by the big bad Wall Street wolf. Do not play dumb with me. You loved the money. You loved walking into high-end boutiques and dropping $50,000 on credit cards you knew we could never actually pay off. You happily closed your eyes to every single red flag because you wanted to look vastly superior to your little sister standing over there." Jamal shoved her backward, forcing Courtney to stumble and catch herself on the edge of the dining table. You are just as shallow and greedy as your mother, Jamal spat, gesturing wildly toward Patricia, who was currently cowering in the corner of the room. You did not marry me for love, Courtney. You married me because you thought I was a walking ATM machine who could fund your pathetic obsession with social status. Well, I have a massive reality check for you, Doctor. William tried to step forward to defend his daughter, but Jamal shot him a lethal glare that immediately stopped the older man in his tracks. Sit down, William, before I tell the feds exactly how much illegal money you helped me wash through your fake charity accounts, Jamal threatened. William immediately slumped heavily back into his velvet dining chair, his wrinkled face turning a terrifyingly sickly shade of ash gray as the harsh reality of his deeply hidden financial crimes were suddenly brought to the brightly lit surface for everyone to witness. Jamal slowly turned his dark attention completely back to his absolutely terrified wife. Courtney was openly weeping uncontrollably, now her chest heaving as the absolute destruction of her life closed in around her. You want to talk about lies? Jamal asked, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl that echoed ominously off the wood-paneled walls. You want to know the real reason I proposed to you? I simply never loved you, Courtney. I could not stand your constant whining and your ridiculous superiority complex. Jamal stepped right into her personal space, his eyes wide and unblinking as he delivered the final devastating blow. I only married you because your father promised to drain his entire 401k retirement account to pay off my massive offshore gambling debts. The heavy silence that followed the explosive confession of Jamal was completely deafening. Williams stood frozen on the other side of the dining table, his expensive martini glass slipping from his weak fingers. The crystal shattered against the polished hardwood floor, sending clear alcohol across the shoes of his terrified wife. William did not blink at the sound of the breaking glass. He slowly turned his head, locking eyes onto Patricia with a look of absolute horror. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He tried again, his throat working frantically as he tried to process the terrifying reality. What did he just say? William choked out his voice, barely a raspy whisper echoing in the large space. What retirement account is he talking about, Patricia? Patricia pressed her back hard against the wood-paneled wall, looking exactly like a trapped animal. She opened her mouth to weave another elaborate lie, but the sheer weight of the collapsing room finally broke her rigid resolve. She let out a loud, ugly sob, burying her perfectly made-up face in her trembling hands. I had to do it, Patricia cried, her voice muffled by her fingers. I had absolutely no other choice in the matter. I was going to publicly expose his massive gambling debts to the entire country club board of directors. How could I ever show my face at the weekly charity luncheons if everyone knew our perfect son-in-law was actually a degenerate gambler on the verge of bankruptcy? I had to fiercely protect our pristine family image at all costs. William took a slow, highly unsteady step forward. His face was completely drained of all healthy color, making him look 20 years older in a matter of mere seconds. How much money, Patricia? He demanded, his voice suddenly roaring to life with terrifying volume that vigorously shook the crystal chandelier hanging brightly above them. How much of my hard-earned money did you secretly give to this pathetic scam artist standing over there? Patricia flinched violently, as if she had been physically struck by his harsh tone. All of it, she wailed, slowly sliding down the wall until she was crouched pathetically on the floor in her ruined designer dress. I forged your signature on the financial release forms exactly 6 months ago. I took the entire $1.5 million out of your private accounts. I thought he was going to brilliantly invest it to quickly save his firm. I thought he was going to pay it back with massive interest before you ever noticed it was missing. $1.5 million. The entire life savings of a man who had diligently worked 40 years to secure a luxurious and comfortable retirement, completely wiped out by a single forged signature and a desperate obsession with high society status. William staggered backward, tightly clutching his chest, as if his heart were physically giving out under the immense pressure. You stole absolutely everything we had, William whispered, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the absolute reality of his complete financial ruin fully set in. He was entirely broke. His corporate pension was completely gone. The fake Wall Street empire was rapidly crashing down around them. There was absolutely nothing left to his name. Then William locked his wide eyes with mine. The anger and profound betrayal instantly melted away, rapidly replaced by a sickening, pathetic desperation. He stumbled across the room, completely ignoring his weeping wife on the floor and his screaming daughter standing frozen by the table. He stopped right in front of me and suddenly dropped heavily to his knees, his expensive suit pants pooling awkwardly on the hardwood floor. "Abby, please," William begged, reaching out with shaking hands to grab the hem of my simple blazer. "You have to save me from this total nightmare. You are my daughter. You cannot possibly let your own father starve in the dangerous streets while you sit on a massive fortune. You have all the financial power now. Just cancel the Apex Holdings buyout contract immediately. Rip up the terrible court order you tricked us with tonight. Let me keep my rightful share of the grandmother estate. If we carefully sell it on the open market next month, I can take my percentage and buy a small apartment in the city. I can survive this disaster. Just give me this one thing, Abby. I am begging you to show some mercy." I looked down at the pathetic broken man kneeling directly at my feet. This was the exact same man who had stood by silently and watched his cruel wife throw me out into a blinding snowstorm 10 years ago because I flatly refused to ruin my own financial future for their precious golden child. He had not shed a single tear for me back then. He only cared right now because his own comfortable life was being violently ripped away. I slowly reached down and firmly peeled his trembling fingers off my jacket, pushing his weak hands away with absolute disgust. My expression remained completely blank, a solid wall of freezing ice that offered absolutely no comfort or salvation to the man who ruthlessly helped destroy my youth. "Cancel the buyout," I repeated softly, letting the sheer absurdity of his desperate request hang heavily in the tense air of the dining room. "Dad, there is absolutely no buyout left to cancel." William stared up at me, his mouth hanging wide open in utter confusion. "What are you talking about?" he stammered nervously. "We own that massive piece of land. The property deed is absolutely totally clear." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed loudly in the silent room. "Did you honestly not know that Mom secretly used the original property deed as collateral for a massive $2 million cash loan from the Russian mob to cover the disastrous margin calls of Jamal last month?" The color completely vanished from the face of my father. William stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "The Russian mob," he repeated, his voice barely a hollow whisper. He slowly turned his head to look at Patricia, who was still weeping pathetically on the expensive hardwood floor. "Patricia, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not borrow money from violent criminals to fund the fake lifestyle of this pathetic man." Patricia simply sobbed louder, burying her face into her trembling hands. The undeniable truth hit William like a runaway freight train. He was not just entirely broke. He was in immediate, severe physical danger. He knew exactly what kind of ruthless people operated those illegal lending syndicates in the city. They did not care about court orders or legal technicalities. They only cared about getting their cash back with massive interest, and they would happily break every single bone in his body to collect it. William collapsed entirely, slumping back against the dark wood-paneled wall of the restaurant and clutching his chest. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy mahogany doors, as if armed debt collectors were going to burst into the dining room at any given second to drag him away into the cold night. While our father was having a legitimate panic attack over the very real threat of violent loan sharks, my older sister decided it was the perfect time to center the entire universe entirely around herself once again. Courtney stepped right over the trembling legs of our mother and marched directly up to me. She aggressively smoothed down the front of her wrinkled silk designer blouse and lifted her chin, completely disconnected from the terrifying reality unfolding around her. The perfect golden child simply refused to accept defeat. "Okay, Abby," Courtney said, her voice dripping with an absurd amount of entitled arrogance. "You won this stupid little real estate game. You proved your petty little point. Now it is time for you to do the right thing and fix this massive mess you created. Since you apparently own this massive corporate conglomerate now, I expect you to instantly create an executive position for me. You are going to hire me as the Chief Medical Officer of Apex Holdings starting tomorrow morning. I expect a base salary of exactly $1 million a year, full premium corporate benefits, and a massive signing bonus to cover the emotional distress you caused me tonight." I stared at my sister, genuinely stunned by her absolute lack of basic situational awareness. Did you not just hear me say that violent criminals are coming for your parents? I asked flatly. Courtney waved her manicured hand dismissively in the air. That is entirely their problem, not mine. They made their poor financial choices. But I am a licensed doctor. I am the absolute prestige and the crowning glory of this entire family. You completely owe me this high-paying job to save our public reputation. You need a respected medical professional on your corporate board to give your little business actual legitimacy in the elite circles of Manhattan. I am offering to save you from your own lack of high-class education. You should be down on your knees thanking me for gracefully lowering myself to work for a high school dropout. I looked at her perfectly manicured nails, her expensive blowout, and the absolute delusion shining brightly in her eyes. And then I did the only thing I could possibly do in that ridiculous situation. I laughed. I laughed loudly, a deep and echoing sound that bounced aggressively off the walls of the private dining room. Courtney flushed bright red, taking a furious step forward. "Stop laughing at me," she shrieked, stamping her expensive heel on the floor like a petulant toddler throwing a massive tantrum. "I am dead serious." I wiped a tear of pure amusement from my eye and shook my head. "You are completely delusional, Courtney. Apex Holdings does not need a chief medical officer because we liquidate seized assets for the federal government. And even if we did need a medical professional, I would never in a million years hire a spoiled, incompetent narcissist who cannot even afford to pay her own mortgage without begging our parents for illegal cash handouts. You are entirely useless to me, and you have absolutely zero leverage here." As I completely dismissed my furious sister, I briefly took my eyes off the most dangerous person in the room. Jamal had been standing completely silent near the broken glass on the floor, listening to every single word. The terrifying reality of his situation had finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his sanity. He knew his venture capital firm was currently being raided by federal agents. He knew the massive Ponzi scheme was fully exposed. I knew he was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. But worst of all, he knew about the $2 million debt owed to the Russian mob. The mob would not wait for a federal trial. They would find him long before the police ever put him behind bars. He was a dead man walking cornered like a rabid animal with absolutely nothing left to lose. Before I could turn my head back in his direction, Jamal let out a primal roar of absolute fury. He lunged across the room, grabbing a heavy empty wine bottle from the table and aggressively smashing it against the hard edge of the wooden chair. The thick green glass shattered loudly, leaving a jagged, lethal weapon in his large hand. He grabbed me violently from behind, wrapping his thick arm tightly around my neck and pulling me backward against his chest. The freezing cold, jagged edge of the broken glass pressed dangerously hard against my throat. "Transfer $10 million to my offshore account right now," Jamal screamed, his hot breath hitting my ear, "or I will kill you." The dining room erupted into pandemonium. The sound of Jamal screaming and the crash of the wine bottle acted like a gunshot. Wealthy diners shrieked in terror, scrambling out of velvet chairs and shoving each other to reach the exit. Plates of expensive food crashed to the floor as mahogany doors were ripped open by a fleeing crowd, desperate to escape the crazed man holding a lethal weapon to my throat. I stood perfectly still. My heart beat steadily, unaffected by the chaotic frenzy. I could feel violent trembling in the thick arm Jamal wrapped tightly around my neck. The freezing edge of broken green glass pressed firmly against my skin. The sharp point hovered millimeters from my jugular vein. His breathing was ragged, smelling strongly of scotch. He sweated profusely, droplets falling onto my blazer. In the corner, my parents reacted exactly how I knew they would. William and Patricia did not rush forward to save their youngest daughter. They did not beg the crazed venture capitalist to spare my life. Instead, they cowardly scrambled backward, hiding behind an overturned serving cart. William covered his head entirely, abandoning his paternal instincts. But the reaction of my older sister cemented the moral bankruptcy of my family. Courtney did not hide. She stood frozen near the shattered dining table, staring at the terrifying hostage situation. I thought she might show human empathy. I thought she might scream for her husband to drop the weapon. I was completely wrong. Her eyes widened with pure greed. Make her transfer money to my account too, Courtney suddenly yelled over the chaotic noise of the restaurant. Do not just take the 10 million for yourself, Jamal. I am your wife. We are in massive debt. Make her send 5 million to my personal checking account right now before you let her go. She owes me for ruining my life. I closed my eyes for a second, wanting to laugh at the sheer absurdity of her demand. I had a jagged piece of glass pressing into my throat, and my sister was actively trying to negotiate a better payout for my potential murder. Jamal tightened his aggressive grip around my neck. "Shut your mouth, Courtney," he roared, his voice cracking with panic. "Turn on your phone right now, Abby. Open your banking app and initiate the wire transfer to the offshore routing number I give you. If you hesitate for a single second, I swear I will end your life right here." I kept my breathing slow and measured. I knew if I showed fear, he would lose control. "Jamal, listen to my voice," I said, keeping my tone incredibly calm, smooth, and devoid of emotion. "I need you to use that brilliant Wall Street brain of yours for just 1 second. You'll want $10 million transferred to an offshore account in the middle of the night. Do you honestly think a standard banking application is going to instantly clear a transaction of that massive magnitude without flagging it? A wire transfer of that size will immediately trigger a high-priority alert with the Office of Foreign Assets Control. The federal government will freeze the funds, lock down the receiving account, and ping your exact physical location before you can even walk out the front doors. The money will be useless to you, and the Russian mob will still be waiting in the shadows." Jamal hesitated. The jagged glass moved slightly away from my skin as his financial training clashed violently with his panic. "So how do I get the money out?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "I have to pay them tonight, Abby. They are going to kill me if I do not pay them tonight." I carefully raised my right hand, moving incredibly slowly so I would not startle him. I reached into the front pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. "I do not use standard retail banking apps, Jamal. Apex Holdings utilizes a specialized corporate ledger system directly linked to our offshore reserves. It completely bypasses standard federal holds because the funds are technically pre-cleared for real estate acquisitions. I can send the money instantly, but I cannot do it with a passcode. The application requires biometric authentication. It needs my thumbprint to open the secure server." Jamal stared at the black screen of the phone in my hand. His greed and terror completely blinded him to the obvious trap I had just laid out. He desperately wanted to believe there was a magical escape route from the consequences of his criminal actions. "Do it," he ordered, shoving my hand closer to my face. "Press your thumb to the screen right now and authorize the transaction." I slowly rotated the phone, resting my thumb lightly against the biometric sensor. I did not open a banking application. The fingerprint scanner on this specific device was hardwired directly to a silent panic button. It was a fail-safe protocol designed specifically for high-value federal contractors operating under the direct protection of the United States government. I pressed my thumb down firmly. The screen flashed a bright, solid crimson red for 1 microsecond before going completely dark again. The silent countdown had officially begun. "Where is the money?" Jamal screamed, pressing the glass back against my throat as the phone screen remained entirely blank. "Why is it not working?" I tilted my head slightly, looking directly into his terrified eyes through the reflection in the dark screen of the phone. I smiled, a cold, calculating expression that finally made the blood drain completely from his face. "Because your time is officially up, Jamal." Less than 2 seconds later, the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the front of the restaurant violently exploded inward. A deafening crash shook the entire building as highly trained tactical operatives completely shattered the reinforced glass. Heavy smoke grenades rolled across the expensive hardwood floor, hissing loudly as thick white smoke instantly filled the room. Red laser sights pierced through the blinding smoke, sweeping aggressively across the chaotic dining room. A heavily armed Federal Special Weapons and Tactics team swarmed into the enclosed space, their heavy combat boots crushing the broken glass beneath them as they aimed their assault rifles directly at the man holding me hostage. "Drop the weapon immediately and get on the ground." A commanding voice roared through a heavy tactical megaphone, completely drowning out the pathetic screams of my family. Three heavily armored tactical officers slammed into Jamal with the force of a freight train. The sheer physical impact knocked the breath out of him, sending the jagged green glass flying harmlessly out of his hand to shatter against the far wall. I was thrown violently to the side, landing hard on the carpeted floor as the SWAT team ruthlessly pinned my attacker to the ground. Zip ties were secured around his thick wrists before he could even process what happened. The dining room was completely saturated with thick white smoke and the blinding glare of high-intensity tactical flashlights. Paramedics rushed through the shattered front windows, but before anyone could check my throat for lacerations, a piercing shriek cut through the chaotic noise. Courtney scrambled out from behind the overturned serving cart. Her expensive silk blouse ruined her face, smeared with mascara and fake tears. She practically threw herself at the nearest tactical commander, aggressively pointing her manicured finger directly at me. "Arrest her right now!" Courtney screamed hysterically, playing the role of the ultimate victim with terrifying ease. "She hired him to kill us. My insane sister orchestrated this entire nightmare. She paid my husband to hold her hostage so she could murder our parents and steal our massive family inheritance." The absolute audacity of her lie was staggering, but she delivered it with such unhinged conviction that two heavily armed officers immediately turned their assault rifles in my direction. Within 10 minutes, the entire remaining family was aggressively escorted out of the ruined restaurant and shoved into the back of separate heavily armored police cruisers. The cold, suffocating reality of the situation finally set in as the convoy sped through the dark streets of Manhattan. The flashing red and blue emergency lights illuminated the terrified faces of my parents in the vehicle ahead of me. We were unceremoniously dumped into the bleak, fluorescent-lit holding area of the central NYPD precinct. The air smelled strongly of stale coffee and raw desperation. Jamal was dragged away in heavy iron chains, while William, Patricia, Courtney, and I were corralled into a single cramped interrogation room by a deeply exhausted lead detective who clearly had no patience for wealthy Manhattan family drama. The second the heavy metal door clicked shut, my family united with lightning speed. The deep fractures and vicious betrayals that had just torn them apart completely vanished. Faced with the terrifying prospect of actual prison time, they seamlessly reverted to their absolute favorite pastime, which was entirely destroying me to save themselves. William slammed his hands on the metal table, looking the weary detective dead in the eye. "You have to understand the severe psychological damage we are dealing with here." My father lied smoothly, his voice dripping with fake paternal concern. "My youngest daughter, Abby, is deeply unwell. She is a highly dangerous, unhinged high school dropout who has harbored a sick, obsessive jealousy toward her successful older sister for over a decade." Patricia immediately chimed in, perfectly producing fresh, pathetic tears on command. "She tricked us into coming to that restaurant tonight," Patricia sobbed, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. "She fabricated some elaborate delusion about owning a multi-million-dollar corporate holding company. She shoved fake legal documents in our faces and threatened to leave us completely homeless if we did not sign over everything we owned." Courtney stepped right up to the detective, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. When my husband tried to stand up to her, she completely snapped. Courtney lied effortlessly. She told Jamal she had hired armed thugs to wait outside the restaurant. She forced him to pick up that broken bottle. She orchestrated this entire violent hostage situation just to frame our family and steal my rightful medical career. "You have to lock her up before she actually kills someone." I sat perfectly silent in the cold metal chair, listening to the three people who shared my DNA flawlessly execute a coordinated perjury designed to send me to a federal penitentiary for the rest of my natural life. They did not stutter, they did not hesitate. They wove a masterful, cohesive narrative that perfectly explained away the forged documents, the missing retirement funds, and the violent assault. They painted me as a violent mastermind, and themselves as the innocent victims of my unhinged jealousy. It was the exact same toxic dynamic they had used to throw me out into the snow 10 years ago, only this time the stakes were literally life and death. The lead detective listened to their entire fabricated story in absolute silence. He slowly closed his worn leather notebook and let out a long, heavy sigh. He turned his tired eyes toward me, his expression hardening into intense, undeniable suspicion. I was sitting there in a simple blazer, completely silent, while three seemingly respectable citizens corroborated a terrifying story of premeditated attempted murder. The detective did not care about the truth. He cared about closing a messy case before his shift ended. He slowly reached around to the back of his tactical belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. They clinked loudly in the quiet interrogation room, a terrifying sound that brought a massive, triumphant smile to the face of my sister. "Stand up and put your hands behind your back," the detective ordered harshly, stepping directly toward me. "You are under arrest for domestic terrorism, extortion, and attempted murder." William and Patricia let out a simultaneous sigh of profound relief. Courtney crossed her arms, staring down at me with absolute victorious malice. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my eyes locked on the detective, my expression completely blank. He took another aggressive step forward, reaching out to grab my wrist. Just as his hand brushed against my sleeve, the heavy metal door of the interrogation room violently swung open, slamming loudly against the concrete wall. The detective spun around, his hand instinctively dropping to his holstered weapon. A tall, imposing man in a meticulously tailored, razor-sharp navy suit walked confidently into the cramped room. He did not look at the detective, and he did not spare a single glance for my terrified parents or my furious sister. He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive jacket, pulling out a solid gold federal badge and flashing it under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was United States Attorney Davis. The metal door of the interrogation room swung back against the concrete wall with a resounding crash. The tall, imposing man in the tailored navy suit did not even flinch at the noise. He walked confidently into the cramped space, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. He did not spare a single glance for my mother, who was still clutching her crumpled tissue, or my father, who was standing by the metal table. He ignored my sister, who was still wearing her victorious, malicious smirk. The local lead detective immediately froze in his tracks, the heavy steel handcuffs dangling completely uselessly from his thick fingers. The detective stared wide-eyed at the solid gold federal badge shining brilliantly under the harsh fluorescent lights. United States Attorney Davis moved with the effortless authority of a man who commanded absolute respect in every single room he ever entered. He stepped directly between me and the local detective, physically blocking the NYPD officer from coming anywhere near me. Davis slowly lowered his impressive badge and fixed the trembling detective with a freezing, completely unblinking stare. "You are completely out of your legal jurisdiction," Detective Davis stated, his voice quiet but echoing with absolute terrifying power. "I strongly suggest you put those handcuffs away before I have your badge permanently revoked for interfering with a highly classified federal operation. You can step outside and wait for my direct orders." The local detective instantly turned ash gray. He did not argue. He did not ask a single question. He knew exactly what a federal takeover looked like, and he wanted absolutely no part of the massive legal hurricane that was about to rip through his precinct. The detective hastily clipped the handcuffs back onto his belt, desperately muttered a rapid, panicked apology, and practically sprinted out of the interrogation room. He pulled the metal door shut tightly behind him, leaving my stunned family trapped securely in the small room with the most powerful federal prosecutor in the entire state of New York. Davis finally turned away and looked down at me. The icy, intimidating glare he had just used on the detective completely melted away, replaced by a look of profound, genuine respect. He reached out his right hand. I remained perfectly calm, slowly standing up from the cold metal chair and firmly shaking his hand. "Excellent sting operation, Madam CEO," Davis said loudly, ensuring his voice carried to every single corner of the silent room. "We have everything we need to put him away for the rest of his natural life." The biometric panic button activation was perfectly timed. The tactical entry team secured the offshore routing numbers from his smashed phone, and the audio surveillance bugs planted in your blazer captured his explicit extortion demands and his full confession regarding the illegal retirement fund transfers. The silence that instantly descended upon my family was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a massive explosion. The intricate, flawless web of lies they had just aggressively spun for the local detective disintegrated into thin air. William stood completely frozen, his jaw hanging slightly open as his brain aggressively tried and failed to process the terrifying reality of the situation. Courtney lost all the color in her face. Her triumphant smirk vanished, violently replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She stumbled backward until her spine hit the concrete wall, her trembling hands flying up to cover her mouth. But Patricia refused to accept her absolute defeat. My mother was a woman who had built her entire existence on maintaining a perfect, wealthy illusion, and she was incapable of handling the truth. She stepped forward, her voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of desperation and furious denial. "Sting operation," Patricia stammered loudly, pointing a wildly trembling finger in my direction. "What on earth are you talking about, Mr. Davis? You are making a massive mistake. She is not a chief executive officer of anything. She is just a pathetic high school dropout who runs a cheap real estate scam. She forged those legal documents to steal my mother's estate. She hired that violent man to attack us tonight. You need to arrest her immediately." Davis slowly turned his head to look at my mother. He did not look angry. He looked at her with the exact same mild, disgusted pity one might reserve for a squashed insect on the sidewalk. "You are currently standing in the middle of a federal interrogation room actively committing perjury," Mrs. Davis noted coldly. "Every single word spoken in this room is being actively recorded. Your son-in-law is currently downstairs singing like a canary to save himself from the Russian mob. We know exactly what you did with the property deed. We know exactly how much illegal cash you washed through the country club accounts to cover his massive gambling debts. You are going to face federal racketeering charges, and I highly suggest you invoke your right to remain silent right now." Patricia let out a high-pitched gasp, stumbling backward and collapsing heavily into the metal chair I had just vacated. Her perfect facade was permanently shattered. William buried his face in his hands, openly weeping, as the absolute certainty of federal prison finally crushed his soul. I slowly stood up completely straight, carefully smoothing out the wrinkles in my simple blazer. I looked down at the three people who had spent my entire life violently tearing me down, humiliating me and treating me like garbage. The victory was absolute, and it tasted sweeter than I could have ever imagined. I looked directly into the terrified, weeping eyes of my mother. "Apex Holdings is not just a real estate firm, Mom," I stated clearly, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. "We are the primary asset liquidation contractor for the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Marshals. My job is hunting down the assets of financial terrorists." The words hung heavily in the freezing air of the cramped interrogation room. U.S. Attorney Davis stepped gracefully to the side, maintaining an intimidating silence, while silently granting me absolute control over the enclosed space. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a small silver key, unlocking the heavy black leather briefcase he had carried in with him. He placed it squarely on the scratched metal table in the center of the room and simply gestured for me to proceed. I walked forward, my heels clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavily bound legal file that was easily 5 inches thick. I slammed the dense stack of documents down directly in front of my father. The sheer force of the impact made William violently jump in his cold metal chair. I did not just stumble into that private restaurant dining room tonight to play some petty, childish game of family revenge. I stated, my voice echoing off the bleak concrete walls. "Do you honestly think an entire heavily armed federal special weapons and tactics task force gets mobilized in the middle of Manhattan over a simple domestic real estate dispute?" I crossed my arms, looking down at the pathetic ruins of my biological family. "I have been aggressively tracking the complex offshore financial movements of your precious golden son-in-law for an entire 12 months under a highly classified exclusive contract with the United States Department of Justice. Jamal was never just a bad venture capitalist who made a few poor gambling bets on the stock market. He was actively operating a massive decentralized Ponzi scheme designed specifically to funnel millions of dollars to international organized crime syndicates." Courtney let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper, slowly sliding down the concrete wall until she was sitting heavily on the dirty floor. "But I did not know anything," Courtney pleaded, her previous arrogance entirely evaporated into thin air. "I swear to God, Abby, he completely lied to me. He handled all the banking and all the corporate accounts. I am just a dedicated medical doctor. You have to tell the federal prosecutor that I am completely innocent in all of this. I looked down at my older sister, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, calculated indifference. Your authorized signature is permanently inked on 4 different luxury car leases and 2 separate Manhattan penthouse mortgages that were paid for entirely with stolen pensioner funds. Courtney, I corrected her harshly. The Department of Justice does not care one bit about your supposed willful ignorance. You gleefully spent millions of dollars of dirty blood money because you were far too obsessed with your pathetic social status to ask a single logical question about where the endless stream of cash was actually coming from. You are going to permanently lose your medical license tomorrow morning, and you will be facing severe federal tax evasion charges by the end of the week. Courtney buried her face deep in her knees, sobbing violently as the absolute destruction of her entire fake reality finally crushed her. I turned my attention completely away from her pathetic display and focused my intense, predatory gaze squarely on my parents. William and Patricia were staring at the massive file on the metal table as if it were a live explosive device rigged to detonate. Patricia tried desperately to sit up straight, frantically clinging to the very last shredded remnants of her fake high society dignity. Well, we are clearly the victims here as well, my mother stated, her voice shaking violently, despite her desperate attempt to sound authoritative. You heard him upstairs in the restaurant, Abby. He brutally stole your father's entire life savings. He completely ruined our long-term financial future. If you are actually working for the federal government now, you need to use your power to help us get our stolen money back immediately. It is your duty as a daughter. I let out a sharp, incredibly dark, humorless laugh that made my mother physically flinch backward. Get your money back, I repeated slowly, shaking my head in pure, unadulterated disgust at her relentless entitlement. Do you really sit there and think you are the innocent, tragic victims in this massive federal criminal investigation? I reached into the thick file and forcefully pulled out a heavy stack of glossy, highly detailed bank statements. I fanned them out aggressively across the cold metal table directly under the harsh, bright fluorescent lights. These are the highly secured internal transaction logs for your private checking accounts at the elite Oakwood Country Club, I stated coldly, watching all the remaining color aggressively drain from their wrinkled faces. For the past 12 months, Jamal desperately needed a secure, untraceable way to wash his stolen venture capital funds without instantly triggering federal money laundering alerts at the major banks. He urgently needed legitimate-looking domestic accounts owned by wealthy American citizens with absolutely zero criminal records. So he came straight to his desperately greedy status obsessed in laws. William turned completely white, his hands trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the metal table just to stay upright. Abby, you do not understand the situation, my father stammered, his terrified eyes darting frantically between the bank statements and the silent, imposing figure of U.S. Attorney Davis, standing near the door. He told us those were just temporary holding accounts for his most elite international clients. He said his venture capital firm was undergoing a massive corporate restructuring, and he just needed a quick, temporary favor. He gave us a generous 10% commission for every single check we deposited. We were just trying to help our family succeed. You were trying to secretly fund your pathetic, desperate obsession with maintaining a fake millionaire lifestyle that you could never actually afford. I snapped back, my voice rising with absolute, undeniable authority. You knew exactly what you were doing behind closed doors. You knew perfectly well that legitimate Wall Street firms do not ever ask private citizens to deposit massive corporate checks into personal country club accounts. You willfully ignored every single massive legal red flag because he was quietly handing you tens of thousands of dollars in free unrecorded cash every single month to pay your ridiculous luxury country club dues. I grabbed a bright red marker from the table and aggressively circled 3 different massive financial transactions on the top page of the bank. I pushed the highlighted paper directly into the violently trembling hands of my mother. She stared down at the astronomical numbers, her breath suddenly hitching painfully in her throat as the inescapable trap completely closed around her. You did not just forge a single signature to hand over a retirement fund to a degenerate gambler, I said, leaning directly over the metal table until I was mere inches away from her terrified, tear-stained face. You actively facilitated a massive international criminal enterprise. I pointed a steady finger directly at the heavily circled financial documents. Mom, Dad, all those investment checks you deposited for Jamal from your country club friends. You were acting as illegal money mules. You laundered over $4 million across state lines. U.S. Attorney Davis stepped forward seamlessly, taking over the interrogation with the cold, calculated precision of a seasoned federal prosecutor. He placed both of his hands firmly on the scratched metal table, leaning his tall frame toward my aggressively trembling parents. The severity of your situation cannot be overstated. Davis began, his deep voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or denial. You did not just passively receive funds from a criminal enterprise, you actively participated in its rapid expansion. You deliberately weaponized your social standing at the Oakwood Country Club to prey upon the exact people who trusted you the most. I watched my father physically shrink into his cold metal chair as I laid out the specific bank logs. We have sworn testimonies from 17 different elderly country club members, I added, keeping my tone perfectly measured. You sat across from grieving widows at charity luncheons. You played 18 holes of golf with retired surgeons. You looked these vulnerable, trusting people dead in the eye and aggressively pitched Jamal as a Wall Street financial prodigy. You convinced people like Mrs. Higgins and Arthur Henderson to liquidate their safe, reliable retirement portfolios and hand the cash directly over to your son-in-law. And you did it all for a 5% cut, Davis stated flatly, dropping a printed Federal ledger on top of the bank statements. For every single dollar you successfully funneled into his offshore Ponzi scheme, Jamal handed you a secret 5% finder's fee directly under the table. You took tens of thousands of dollars in unrecorded illegal cash kickbacks to fund your luxury car leases, your extravagant European vacations, and your ridiculous club dues. You completely destroyed the financial lives of the very people you called your closest friends, just to maintain an illusion of wealth. Patricia let out a guttural, horrifying wail, violently burying her face into her trembling hands. "We did not know he was stealing it," she shrieked, her voice muffled and wet with panicked tears. "We thought it was a legitimate high-yield investment fund. We thought we were genuinely helping our friends get rich. He completely manipulated us." Ignorance is not a legal defense when you are operating an unlicensed financial brokerage out of a country club dining room, Davis countered instantly, completely unmoved by her hysterical tears. But the Department of Justice is not simply charging you with operating an unlicensed brokerage or basic tax evasion. Because you actively recruited investors, took a percentage of the stolen funds, and used interstate banking wires to launder the proceeds, you are officially categorized as active members of a continuous criminal enterprise. Furthermore, some of those funds were tracked directly to accounts controlled by international organized crime. William finally looked up, his face entirely devoid of color, his eyes bloodshot and wide with absolute terror. "What exactly does that mean?" he whispered, his voice cracking violently under the immense weight of the federal scrutiny. "It means you are both being federally indicted under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act," Davis answered, delivering the fatal blow with terrifying calmness. The RICO Act was designed specifically to dismantle organized crime syndicates, mob families, and massive financial fraud rings. It carries mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines that federal judges cannot simply waive for first-time white-collar offenders. Given the massive financial scale of this specific Ponzi scheme, the involvement of illegal syndicate money, and the sheer number of elderly victims involved, you are both facing a minimum of 25 years in a federal penitentiary. 25 years. It was a definitive death sentence for two people rapidly approaching their 60s. The remaining facade of the wealthy, untouchable Manhattan elite completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of me. William clutched his chest tightly, gasping for air as a severe panic attack violently seized his lungs. Patricia slumped forward onto the cold metal table, weeping uncontrollably into the scattered, damning evidence of her own catastrophic greed. They had sacrificed my entire childhood and my future just to protect their precious public image, and now that exact same obsession with status was going to bury them in a concrete cell for the rest of their natural lives. The heavy, suffocating silence of their absolute ruin was suddenly shattered by a sharp, highly inappropriate sound. It started as a low, breathy giggle from the dark corner of the room, quickly escalating into a loud, unhinged peal of hysterical laughter. U.S. Attorney Davis slowly turned his head, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion as he looked at my older sister. Courtney was sitting on the dirty linoleum floor, her knees pulled tight to her chest, laughing so hard that fresh tears were aggressively streaming down her ruined designer makeup. She threw her head back, the sound bouncing harshly off the concrete walls of the interrogation room. "You are all completely insane," Courtney gasped out aggressively, wiping her eyes with the back of her trembling hand. She used the concrete wall to slowly push herself up to her feet, aggressively smoothing down her wrinkled silk skirt. She looked at our weeping parents with absolute disgust before turning her manic, wide-eyed gaze toward the federal prosecutor. "You can lock them up forever for all I care," Courtney declared loudly, callously, throwing our mother and father entirely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. They were stupid enough to get involved in his cheap little financial scams. But you cannot touch me. I am completely innocent in this ridiculous witch hunt. Davis crossed his arms over his broad chest. "Your authorized signature is on the fraudulent mortgages, Courtney. You directly benefited from the stolen funds to maintain your own lifestyle. I am a doctor." Courtney screamed, her superiority complex violently rearing its ugly head one final time as she desperately clung to her shattered identity. "I save human lives for a living. I spend my days in sterile operating rooms, not country club golf courses. I have absolutely nothing to do with the pathetic financial dealings of my husband or my greedy parents. I have medical immunity from these types of white-collar financial investigations. I am a highly respected, board-certified medical professional, and the federal government has absolutely zero jurisdiction over my clinical practice or my personal freedom." She genuinely believed it. The golden child had been shielded from real-world consequences for so long that she had completely convinced herself she possessed some magical, untouchable status that made her immune to federal law. She stood there lifting her chin with an absurd amount of arrogant defiance, waiting for the United States Attorney to apologize and open the heavy metal interrogation room door for her to leave. I did not laugh this time. I simply stared at my older sister, feeling a dark, profound sense of final closure washing over me. I reached my right hand back into the heavy black leather briefcase sitting on the metal table. I bypassed the thick stacks of financial ledgers and pulled out a single thin secondary file. It was securely bound with a bright red tab, a universal federal indicator for highly classified immediate action intelligence. I placed it gently on the table, keeping my hand resting firmly on top of the smooth cardboard cover. "You have always loved throwing your prestigious medical career in my face, Courtney," I said, my voice completely steady and void of any remaining sisterly affection. "You constantly used your expensive degree as a weapon to make sure everyone in our social circle knew I was the absolute failure of the family." Courtney sneered at me, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "Because you are a failure, Abby. You are a pathetic high school dropout pretending to play corporate spy. I am a licensed physician. I am the absolute pride of this family." I slowly opened the red-tabbed file, flipping directly to the very first page of the densely typed federal investigation report. I looked up from the glowing seal of the medical board, meeting her arrogant, delusional stare with eyes made of pure, unbreakable ice. "About that medical license, Courtney, it was permanently revoked exactly 3 years ago by the state medical board." I finished the sentence, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. The absolute silence that followed my statement was deafening. Courtney stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. William and Patricia slowly turned their heads to look at their perfect, untouchable golden child. The red-tabbed file on the table contained 80 pages of highly classified federal healthcare investigations, and I was going to read every single damning detail to them right here under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You are completely lying," Courtney finally whispered, her voice shaking violently as she desperately backed away from the metal table. "I am a highly respected physician. I have a thriving luxury wellness clinic in the heart of Soho. I have hundreds of wealthy elite clients who depend on my specialized medical expertise every single day. You cannot just invent a ridiculous, jealous lie to ruin my flawless reputation. I did not invent a single thing, I replied smoothly, opening the red folder and pulling out a certified, heavily stamped document directly from the New York State Department of Health. I slid it across the scratched metal table so she could see the glowing official seal. You did a fantastic job of keeping it a secret from the family. 3 years ago, the state medical board quietly launched a massive audit of your private practice. They discovered that you were aggressively billing Medicare for highly expensive specialized treatments that were never actually rendered to elderly patients. You fabricated thousands of electronic medical records inventing ghost appointments and billing the federal government for millions of dollars in fraudulent claims. The remaining color completely drained from the face of my mother. Patricia clutched her chest, her eyes darting frantically between me and her absolute favorite daughter. Courtney, what is she talking about? Patricia demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. Tell her she is making this up. Tell me you did not commit federal healthcare fraud. Courtney squeezed her eyes shut, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she vehemently refused to look at our mother. The medical board gave you a choice. I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly in the small claustrophobic room. They offered you a quiet, immediate revocation of your medical license and heavy financial restitution to avoid a massive, highly public criminal trial. You took the deal to save yourself from federal prison. But you could not handle the humiliating reality of losing your elite social status. You could not stomach the terrifying idea of coming home and admitting to our hypercritical parents that you were actually a massive, catastrophic failure. So you simply pretended the license revocation never happened. You illegally kept the doors of your luxury wellness clinic open. U.S. Attorney Davis interjected, his imposing voice joining the brutal, systematic takedown. But without a valid medical license, you could no longer accept actual health insurance payouts. Your legitimate revenue stream completely dried up overnight. You were drowning in exorbitant commercial rent and massive personal debt. That is exactly when your husband stepped in with a brilliant, highly illegal solution to save your failing facade. I pointed a firm finger directly at the shivering form of my older sister. Jamal desperately needed a clean, cash-heavy business front to help wash the millions of dollars he was actively stealing through his Ponzi scheme, I explained, connecting the final devastating dots of their joint criminal enterprise. You needed a massive influx of cash to keep up the fake illusion of your successful medical career. So you formed a horrific partnership. Jamal funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen pensioner money directly into your clinic under the guise of anonymous private investments. You used the dirty money to pay your staff, keep the lights on, and maintain your lavish personal lifestyle. You were entirely complicit in his financial crimes. William let out a choked, painful gasp, burying his face deep in his hands as his entire world completely collapsed around him. But the financial fraud was only the tip of the iceberg, I stated, dropping the final, most devastating document onto the table. It was a thick stack of illegally authorized prescription logs. In order to generate the massive amounts of untraceable physical cash Jamal needed to pay off his aggressive Russian loan sharks, you turned your luxury wellness clinic into a glorified high-end pill mill. Courtney let out a piercing shriek, violently slapping her hands over her ears, as if she could physically block out the horrifying truth. You used your revoked federal prescription pad to illegally authorize massive quantities of highly addictive narcotics. I roared, my voice completely filling the small room and shattering her remaining delusions. You sold thousands of pills of oxycodone, fentanyl patches, and heavy sedatives strictly for cash under the table to wealthy Manhattan socialites and vulnerable addicts. You did not save human lives, Courtney. You actively destroyed them for sheer profit. You are not a prestigious doctor. You are a common, desperate drug trafficker hiding behind a stolen white coat. The sheer weight of the federal evidence was completely undeniable. The golden child was entirely exposed, permanently stripped of her fake prestige, her stolen wealth, and her absolute arrogance. Courtney slowly lowered her shaking hands from her ears. Her eyes were completely wild, darting frantically around the small interrogation room like a trapped feral animal. She looked at the heavy federal file on the table, then at the disgusted face of the United States Attorney, and finally at the locked metal door. Complete, unadulterated panic completely took over her brain. "I will not go to prison!" Courtney screamed hysterically. "I am better than all of you!" She suddenly lunged forward, her high heels slipping wildly on the cheap linoleum floor as she aggressively shoved past our stunned, weeping parents. She sprinted directly toward the heavy metal door, desperately grabbing the handle and yanking it open in a pathetic, doomed attempt to escape the severe federal consequences of her own horrific actions. The heavy door swung open, but Courtney immediately slammed hard into a solid wall of dark tactical vests. She bounced backward, letting out a sharp gasp of pain as two massive, heavily armed federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped aggressively into the interrogation room, completely blocking her path to freedom. The agents stared down at her with absolute freezing contempt. Courtney stumbled backward, her chest heaving rapidly as she frantically looked around for another way out. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, holding up a thick stack of heavily stamped legal folders directly in her terrified face. "Courtney, you are formally under arrest by order of the federal government," the agent announced, his booming voice sealing her absolute fate. "We have highly secured federal warrants for your immediate detention on multiple felony charges of practicing medicine without a valid state license, extensive interstate drug trafficking, and massive federal healthcare fraud." The heavy steel handcuffs snapped shut around the wrists of my older sister with a loud final click that echoed like a gunshot through the cramped interrogation room. The two massive federal agents did not show a single ounce of hesitation or pity as they roughly spun Courtney around and secured her arms tightly behind her back. The absolute shock of the physical restraint finally broke through her thick wall of delusional arrogance. Courtney collapsed to her knees on the cheap linoleum floor, the sharp impact tearing the fabric of her expensive designer skirt. She sobbed uncontrollably, her chest heaving violently as she desperately gasped for air. This was not the elegant, restrained crying of a wealthy Manhattan socialite facing a minor inconvenience. This was the raw, ugly, guttural wailing of a woman whose entire, carefully constructed universe had just been violently incinerated. The perfect, untouchable doctor was entirely gone, instantly replaced by a pathetic, shivering criminal facing decades in a federal penitentiary for trafficking highly addictive narcotics to vulnerable addicts. She frantically begged the agents, offering them massive cash bribes, screaming that she had powerful friends in the state legislature who would fire them all. The agent simply ignored her frantic screaming, hauling her roughly to her feet and shoving her aggressively toward the heavy metal door. As they dragged Courtney out into the chaotic, brightly lit hallway of the central precinct, a terrifying commotion suddenly erupted just outside our door. Three heavily armed United States Marshals were actively dragging Jamal down the corridor. He was tightly bound in heavy iron transport chains, his expensive tailored suit completely shredded and ruined from the violent tactical takedown at the restaurant. His face was bruised and covered in sweat, but his eyes were incredibly wide with a terrifying, unhinged fury. He locked his wild eyes with my father through the open doorway and completely lost his mind. Jamal thrashed violently against his heavy chains, screaming at the top of his lungs, his deep voice echoing violently off the cold concrete walls. "You ruined me!" William Jamal roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You and your greedy, pathetic wife bled me completely dry. You demanded luxury cars and massive country club dues, while I was desperately trying to keep the Russian mob from cutting my throat. You are the exact reason I am going to die in a federal cell." The marshals forcefully shoved him forward, aggressively pushing him toward the heavily secured transport elevator, but his furious cursing continued to ring clearly through the precinct long after he was dragged out of sight. The absolute venom in the voice of his son-in-law finally broke the last remaining shred of dignity inside my father. William did not even try to fight back when a federal agent stepped up to the scratched metal table and firmly ordered him to stand up. He moved incredibly slowly, looking exactly like an ancient, fragile ghost. His shoulders were slumped entirely forward, his breathing was incredibly shallow, and his eyes stared blankly at the floor. He slowly placed his violently trembling hands behind his back, submitting entirely to the cold steel handcuffs, without uttering a single word of protest. He had spent his entire adult life bowing down to the toxic demands of his narcissistic wife, actively sacrificing his own basic morality and throwing his youngest daughter out into the streets just to maintain a fragile, miserable peace in his household. Now, that exact same spineless cowardice had officially earned him a mandatory 25-year federal prison sentence under the strict guidelines of the RICO Act. He was a completely broken man, entirely hollowed out by his own relentless, pathetic greed. But Patricia was a completely different story. As the female federal agent quickly approached her with a pair of heavy handcuffs, my mother violently snapped out of her weeping stupor. The absolute terror in her eyes was instantly replaced by a blinding, explosive, narcissistic rage. She was a deeply arrogant woman who had spent 60 years aggressively convincing herself she was vastly superior to every single person in the room. She simply could not accept the absolute humiliation of being treated like a common street criminal. "Do not dare touch me with those disgusting things," Patricia shrieked wildly, swinging her manicured hands at the federal agent. "I am a highly prominent member of the elite Oakwood Country Club. I am personal friends with the mayor of this city. You cannot do this to me." The agent easily dodged her weak, pathetic assault, grabbing her wrists with practiced, ruthless efficiency and slamming them forcefully into the metal cuffs. The sharp, undeniable pain of the steel biting into her skin finally made Patricia realize she had absolutely zero power left in this world. United States Attorney Davis watched the entire pathetic display with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, silently shaking his head at her complete lack of human dignity. Stripped entirely of her massive wealth, her stolen freedom, and her precious golden child, Patricia desperately needed someone to blame for her catastrophic downfall. She violently twisted her body away from the federal agent and locked her furious, bloodshot eyes directly onto me. I was standing perfectly still near the heavy metal table wearing a simple, immaculate blazer, completely untouched by the absolute ruin violently consuming my family. The sight of my calm, collected victory pushed my mother completely over the edge of sanity. She lunged forward as far as the heavy chains would allow, her face contorting into a horrifying, unrecognizable mask of pure malice. She aggressively spat in my direction, the saliva landing just inches from my polished shoes. "I wish you were never born," Patricia screamed, the thick veins bulging dangerously in her neck. Her voice was completely raw, dripping heavily with a lifetime of festering toxic hatred. "You are nothing but a disgusting, ugly mistake. You completely ruined this family. You do not belong with us and you do not even look like us." The federal agent aggressively yanked Patricia backward by her heavy chains, loudly shouting a harsh warning for her to keep her mouth shut immediately. The entire interrogation room went completely silent, save for the heavy, frantic breathing of my mother. She stared intensely at me, desperately waiting to see the familiar look of absolute devastation she had successfully inflicted on me countless times throughout my entire childhood. She desperately wanted to see me crumble. She wanted to see me cry. But I did not feel a single ounce of pain. The heavy, toxic words that would have completely shattered my fragile heart 10 years ago now felt completely hollow and entirely meaningless. I stood completely still under the harsh fluorescent lights of the cold interrogation room. I looked directly into her wild, hateful eyes, and a slow, highly calculated smile gradually spread across my face. "Funny you should mention that, Mom," I replied, my voice perfectly smooth and dangerously calm. "I was wondering when we would finally get to the real reason you hated me so much." I calmly reached back into the heavy black leather briefcase sitting on the scratched metal table. My movements were deliberately slow and highly calculated. Patricia stared at me, her chest heaving violently, the heavy iron handcuffs clinking together as she breathed. The absolute venom in her eyes slightly faltered, rapidly replaced by a microscopic flicker of genuine, unadulterated panic. She knew exactly what I was about to do. I pulled out a single sheet of stark white paper. It was not bound in a heavy folder. It did not have a bright red tab. It was simply a highly confidential, notarized medical document printed on the official letterhead of a premier genetic testing facility in Manhattan. I placed it gently on the table right next to the massive pile of federal indictments that had just completely destroyed my family. You always made sure I knew I did not belong. I began, my voice echoing clearly off the cold concrete walls. You spent my entire childhood relentlessly pointing out how my dark hair did not match the perfect blonde aesthetic of you and Courtney. You criticized the shape of my nose, the color of my eyes, and my physical build. You called me an ugly mistake so many times that I actually believed it for the first 18 years of my life. I grew up thinking I was simply a genetic anomaly, a tragic accident of biology that somehow managed to completely ruin your picture, perfect high society family. I took a slow step around the table, closing the physical distance between us, until I was standing directly in front of my handcuffed mother. But the United States Department of Justice does not do anything halfway. Mom, I continued, maintaining aggressive, unbroken eye contact. When you are nominated to become the primary asset liquidation contractor for federal law enforcement, the government requires a Tier 1 security clearance. They do not just check your bank accounts and your criminal record. They dig into every single microscopic detail of your entire existence. They require a full, comprehensive biometric and genetic profile to ensure you cannot be blackmailed by foreign entities using hidden family secrets. I reached out and tapped the white paper on the table with my index finger. The federal agents ran a standard DNA test to verify my identity and my immediate lineage. The results flagged an immediate, highly classified anomaly in the system. Patricia suddenly let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, aggressively yanking her handcuffed wrists backward, as if the piece of paper were actively radiating heat. "Stop talking!" she hissed, her voice completely cracking under the immense, suffocating weight of her deepest, darkest secret finally coming to light. "Do not say another word, Abby. I am commanding you to shut your mouth right now." I ignored her frantic commands entirely. The federal genetic database confirmed a massive discrepancy, I stated loudly, making absolutely sure every single person in the room could hear me perfectly. My DNA was a direct, undeniable match to you, Patricia. You are my biological mother. But my genetic markers did not have a single point of correlation with the man standing in the corner of this room. I slowly turned my head, locking my icy gaze onto my father. William had his face buried deep in his trembling hands, completely destroyed by the federal prison sentence looming over his head. "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a slightly softer yet infinitely more devastating tone, "I am not your biological daughter." William violently jerked his head up, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute horror. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. The heavy, suffocating silence in the interrogation room was suddenly shattered by the sound of his ragged, shallow breathing. He slowly turned his head to look at Patricia. My mother was aggressively shaking her head, tears of pure panic streaming down her ruined makeup. "It is a lie," William, Patricia shrieked desperately, frantically pulling against her heavy iron chains. "She forged that document just to hurt us. She is a malicious, evil liar. It is a fully certified, federally notarized genetic profile." United States Attorney Davis interjected smoothly, instantly destroying her pathetic attempt at denial. "The document is absolutely authentic, William. You are not her biological father." I turned my attention completely back to the trembling, miserable woman who had made my life a living hell. "You did not hate me because I was an ugly mistake," I said, delivering the final fatal blow to her shattered ego. "You hated me because I was a walking, breathing reminder of your own disgusting infidelity. Exactly 32 years ago, you had a secret affair. You got pregnant by another man. You desperately passed me off as the child of your husband to protect your precious high society lifestyle and your unlimited access to his massive corporate pension. I was not the mistake, Patricia. I was the living evidence of your absolute moral bankruptcy. Every single time you looked at my face, you saw your own guilt. Your relentless, toxic hatred for me was nothing but pure, unadulterated projection. You punished me every single day of my life for a sin that you committed." William let out a sound that I will never forget. It was a guttural, agonizing wail of a man whose entire universe had just been brutally ripped apart at the seams. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. He slowly slid down the concrete wall, completely collapsing onto the dirty linoleum floor. He realized he had spent his entire adult life bowing down to a woman who had deeply betrayed him. He had relentlessly worshipped a cheating, manipulative wife. He had aggressively funded the fake luxury lifestyle of a criminal drug trafficking daughter. And in his desperate, pathetic pursuit to keep those two toxic women happy, he had aggressively thrown his only hardworking, truly innocent child out into a blinding snowstorm to freeze. William stared at his handcuffed wrists, his tears falling heavily onto the cold steel. The absolute weight of his catastrophic life choices crushed whatever was left of his weak soul. He had actively helped Patricia tear me down. He had stood silently by the front door 10 years ago, completely refusing to meet my eyes, while I begged him not to let her kick me out of my own childhood home. He had sacrificed my entire future to protect the massive lie that was his marriage. And now, the cheating wife he had protected was going to a federal penitentiary for racketeering, and the golden child he had idolized was being dragged away in heavy chains for trafficking lethal narcotics. The only person in the entire world who actually possessed the power, the massive wealth, and the federal authority to save him from a brutal death behind bars was the exact same child he had ruthlessly discarded. He looked up at me from the dirty floor, his face completely saturated with tears and absolute crushing regret. He tried to speak desperately, wanting to offer some kind of pathetic delayed apology, but his throat completely closed up. The heavy iron chains holding him down were nothing compared to the massive, suffocating guilt actively destroying his mind. The heavy iron chains clinked a hollow, pathetic rhythm against the cheap linoleum as William desperately shifted his weight. He did not try to stand back up. Instead, he fully surrendered to his absolute ruin, dragging his knees across the dirty floor of the interrogation room until he was positioned directly at my feet. The man who had spent my entire life projecting an aura of untouchable Wall Street superiority was now actively groveling like a cornered animal. His expensive tailored suit was hopelessly wrinkled, severely stained with the cold sweat of his own massive panic attack. His silver hair, usually styled with immaculate, expensive precision, hung in chaotic strands across his heavily flushed, tear-soaked face. He looked up at me, his chest heaving violently, finally seeing me not as the dark-haired scapegoat he had ruthlessly discarded, but as the only remaining lifeline in his rapidly collapsing universe. "Abby, please!" William gasped out, his voice completely shattered, entirely devoid of any remaining dignity. "You have to listen to me. You have to understand that I am the real victim in this massive nightmare." He aggressively thrust his handcuffed hands in the direction of Patricia, who was currently being physically restrained by a heavily armed federal agent in the dark corner. "I had absolutely no idea about the DNA. I swear to you on my actual life, Abby. I spent 32 years blindly worshipping a woman who was actively betraying me in the most disgusting way possible. She lied to my face every single day. She completely manipulated my entire existence." Patricia let out a feral, unhinged shriek of pure rage at his sudden betrayal, aggressively fighting against the heavy steel cuffs holding her arms securely behind her back. "You spineless coward," she screamed, her face contorting into a horrifying mask of pure demonic fury. "You gladly spent every single dime of that stolen money. You absolutely loved the country club status just as much as I did." The female federal agent immediately shoved Patricia hard against the cold concrete wall, loudly barking a fierce, undeniable order for her to remain completely silent. William violently flinched at the sharp sound of his wife screaming, but he immediately turned his desperate, bloodshot eyes back to me. He completely ignored the miserable woman he had spent 3 decades fiercely protecting. He was a coward through and through, instantly ready to throw his own cheating wife directly to the federal wolves if it meant saving his own fragile skin. "He manipulated me too." William sobbed rapidly, shifting the heavy blame to his criminal son-in-law. "Jamal and Patricia orchestrated this entire financial scheme completely behind my back. They ruthlessly used my country club connections. They weaponized my pristine social reputation to legitimize his fake offshore fund. I was just a naive, trusting pawn in their sick, twisted criminal enterprise. I never wanted to hurt those elderly investors. I am an innocent man being dragged down by a family of absolute monsters. I stood completely motionless, my expensive leather heels planted firmly on the floor just inches away from his trembling knees. I did not offer a single microscopic flinch of sympathy. I simply let him continue to dig his own pathetic grave under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the federal fluorescent lights. "You have immense power here, Abby." William pleaded, his raspy voice rising in pitch as absolute desperation completely consumed his deteriorating mind. He looked frantically between me and United States Attorney Davis. "You are a high-level Department of Justice asset liquidation contractor. You have deep, powerful federal connections. You can easily talk to the prosecutor. You can cut a legal deal for me. Tell them I was severely manipulated. Tell them I will happily testify against Patricia, against Jamal, and even against Courtney. I will gladly give the federal government absolutely everything they want to secure a permanent RICO conviction against all of them, but you have to keep me out of a federal penitentiary. I will not survive 25 years behind those walls. I will die in there, Abby. Please, you have to save my life." He pushed himself slightly higher on his bruised knees, aggressively trying to force a look of genuine paternal affection onto his terrified, weeping face. It was the most sickening, deeply revolting expression I had ever witnessed in my entire life. "If you do this for me, I promise everything will be completely different." William cried, his heavy tears falling rapidly onto my polished shoes. "I will legally divorce her the absolute second I am cleared. I will completely cut Courtney out of my life forever. It will just be you and me. I will finally be the real loving father you always deserved. I will aggressively make up for every single horrific thing that happened in the past. We can start completely over. We can be a real family." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his fake promises hung in the stagnant air of the interrogation room like a highly toxic cloud. For 32 years, he had possessed every single opportunity to be a real father. He had possessed millions of dollars, a massive Manhattan estate, and completely unlimited resources. Instead, he had chosen to aggressively fund Courtney and her illegal drug trafficking wellness clinic. He had chosen to actively participate in laundering stolen pensioner funds just to maintain his precious golf club memberships. He had deliberately chosen to turn a blind eye to my daily psychological suffering, just to keep a fragile, miserable peace with his deeply narcissistic wife. I looked down at the broken, hyperventilating shell of a man groveling pathetically at my feet. I searched deep within my own soul, actively looking for even a microscopic fraction of pity, a tiny sliver of residual daughterly affection. I found absolutely nothing. My chest was a fortress of solid ice. The deep emotional wounds he had inflicted on me were permanently healed, leaving behind a cold, highly calculating armor that no amount of his pathetic weeping could ever penetrate. "You are not a victim," I stated, my voice cutting through his hysterical sobbing with the precise, lethal edge of a surgical scalpel. "You are just a massive coward who finally ran out of dark places to hide. You did not mastermind the Ponzi scheme yourself, but you absolutely knew exactly where the dirty cash was coming from. You eagerly took your illegal 5% kickbacks under the table and used them to buy vintage wine and luxury car leases, while those vulnerable elderly widows lost their entire life savings. Your blind greed was just as toxic and deeply destructive as hers." William violently shook his head frantically, desperately denying the heavy, suffocating truth pressing down on his chest. "No, Abby, please, you know I am a genuinely good man deep down inside." I slowly leaned forward, bringing my calm face just inches from his terrified, bloodshot eyes. I let the absolute zero temperature of my unbroken gaze completely freeze the remaining desperate breath in his lungs. "You stood by and watched Mom throw me out at 22. You watched me starve. And legally, your signature is still on the fraudulent country club checks. Have fun in federal holding." I did not wait for his inevitable agonizing scream of total defeat. I immediately straightened my immaculate posture, smoothly turning my back on the weeping, completely devastated remains of my former family. I picked up my heavy black leather briefcase from the scratched metal table, offering a firm, highly respectful nod of professional courtesy to United States Attorney Davis. I walked purposefully out of the cold interrogation room without a single backward glance, the heavy steel doors closing securely behind me with a loud absolute finality. 6 months had passed since the heavy steel doors of the central precinct closed permanently behind me, completely severing my ties to the toxic nightmare of my past. The biting bitter cold of that catastrophic winter had long since melted away, entirely replaced by the vibrant, undeniable warmth of a late July morning in New York. The heavy, suffocating weight of being the family scapegoat had been completely lifted from my shoulders, and in its place, I had built an absolute fortress of independent power. The sprawling 10-acre estate nestled deeply within the highly exclusive hills of Westchester County looked entirely unrecognizable. This was the massive historic property that once belonged to my wealthy grandmother. It was the exact same piece of prime real estate that Patricia had aggressively tried to steal through forged legal documents and dirty country club money just weeks before her highly publicized federal arrest. When the Department of Justice officially seized all of their illicit assets, I stepped in and legally purchased the entire estate outright. I used my own legitimate, highly lucrative government contractor earnings to buy it at a massive federal auction discount. But I absolutely refused to restore the gigantic mansion to its former suffocating high society glory. Instead, I brought in a team of commercial contractors and completely gutted the entire building from the inside out. The heavy, oppressive mahogany doors and the sickeningly pretentious velvet drapes were entirely ripped out and thrown into the garbage. In their place, massive floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows now flooded the main hall with brilliant natural sunlight. The grand ballroom where my mother used to host her fake, highly manipulative charity galas, just to show off her stolen wealth, was completely transformed. It was now filled with sleek modern workstations, state-of-the-art collaborative conference tables, and advanced communication servers. This property was no longer a private, secluded monument to toxic inherited wealth and disgusting family secrets. It was now the heavily fortified, bustling corporate headquarters of the Phoenix Vanguard Foundation. I established this aggressive nonprofit organization with one incredibly specific, undeniable mission. We provided massive debt-free business grants and elite corporate mentorship strictly to disadvantaged women who had been actively discarded by society. We deliberately bypassed the traditional elitist academic requirements. We strictly prioritized women who did not possess college degrees. We actively searched for the high school dropouts, the former family scapegoats, and the resilient women who had been ruthlessly told they were completely worthless by the exact people who were supposed to unconditionally love them. We gave them the unrestricted financial capital, the aggressive legal backing, and the cutthroat business strategies they needed to build their own independent commercial empires. As I walked confidently through the bustling main corridor of the estate, the vibrant, highly productive energy of the building was absolutely electric. I wore a perfectly tailored, sharp emerald green business suit, my dark hair pulled back into a sleek, powerful style that commanded immediate, unwavering respect. My expensive designer heels clicked sharply against the imported Italian marble floors. Dozens of highly driven, incredibly intelligent women moved purposely around the open floor plan, securing commercial real estate leases, aggressively negotiating vendor contracts, and reviewing massive financial portfolios. "Good morning, Director," a bright, deeply energetic voice called out over the hum of the bustling office. I turned to see Sarah, my lead financial grant coordinator, approaching me with a thick, highly detailed portfolio. She was a 24-year-old woman who had been viciously kicked out of her childhood home at 18, exactly like me. Now she single-handedly managed a multi-million-dollar operating budget with absolute lethal precision. I offered her a firm, genuinely warm smile, briefly stopping in the middle of the busy hallway to review her documents. I quickly signed my name at the bottom of the page, officially approving a massive $50,000 string-free seed grant for a young single mother opening a commercial bakery in Brooklyn. There was absolutely no toxic competition inside these walls. There was no golden child dynamic or manipulative gaslighting. We were a highly organized, heavily funded army of women who had taken our absolute worst trauma and successfully weaponized it into pure, unadulterated financial success. For my entire life, I had been told that I was an ugly mistake, a genetic anomaly that did not belong in the pristine, wealthy lineage of my family. Patricia had aggressively spent 3 decades trying to erase my existence, hiding her own disgusting infidelity by projecting her massive guilt directly onto my shoulders. William had eagerly played along, sacrificing my future to protect his fragile country club reputation. Courtney had used her fake medical prestige to constantly crush my self-esteem. They had relentlessly tried to bury me under a mountain of lies, abuse, and financial ruin. But they completely failed to realize that they were burying a seed. I did not just survive their brutal systematic destruction. I actively thrived in the absolute darkest conditions, growing roots so deep and so incredibly strong that absolutely nothing could ever tear me down again. I had taken the exact same estate they had desperately tried to steal and turned it into a massive, heavily funded sanctuary for women just like me. I handed the portfolio back to Sarah with a nod of approval and continued my walk down the sunlit, expansive corridor. I eventually reached the massive, custom-built double oak doors at the far end of the Eastern Executive Wing. I pushed them open smoothly, stepping into my massive, beautifully designed corner office. The walls were painted a calming, highly authoritative slate gray, tastefully adorned with framed federal commendations from the Department of Justice, and the massive, officially stamped property deed to the estate. A large, polished glass executive desk sat aggressively in the center of the room, perfectly positioned to overlook the sprawling, meticulously manicured botanical gardens, where several of our newly funded grant recipients were currently holding a vibrant networking brunch. I walked slowly around the massive glass desk, sinking comfortably into my high-backed leather executive chair. I took a slow, deep breath, actively savoring the absolute peace and the undeniable permanent security of the massive empire I had built entirely with my own 2 hands. I reached across the smooth glass surface and picked up a sleek black remote control. I pressed a single button, immediately bringing the massive 80-inch flat-screen television mounted on the far wall to vibrant life. The digital screen flickered brightly for a fraction of a second before instantly locking onto the most prominent, highly viewed national news broadcast in the country. The polished, highly serious face of a famous network anchor filled the massive screen. The volume was set perfectly, his deep, authoritative voice cutting through the quiet tranquility of my executive office. Good morning, and welcome to our continuous coverage of the massive federal financial scandal that has completely rocked the Manhattan elite, the anchor announced, his tone gravely serious. Today marks the absolute end of the line for the individuals involved in the highly publicized Oakwood Country Club Ponzi scheme and the associated luxury medical clinic narcotics ring. Beside his head, a bold, highly aggressive digital graphic flashed repeatedly in bright red and black letters. The glowing text read, "Wall Street Family Fraud Ring Final Sentencing Updates." I leaned back against the plush leather of my executive chair, folding my hands neatly on the pristine glass surface of my desk. I watched the massive screen with absolute unbroken attention. The glowing text read, "Wall Street Family Fraud Ring Final Sentencing Updates." The news anchor adjusted his perfectly tailored suit jacket, his expression shifting into a mask of severe practiced gravity. "Good morning to our viewers joining us across the country," the anchor began, his resonant voice filling every corner of my quiet, sunlit office. Today, the gavel finally came down on one of the most audacious and deeply destructive white-collar criminal syndicates in recent New York history. Federal Judge Marcus Thorne delivered a series of devastating, uncompromising sentences this morning, officially closing the book on the catastrophic Oakwood Country Club Ponzi scheme. The screen quickly transitioned from the polished news studio to high-definition footage of the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Throngs of aggressive reporters and flashing cameras surrounded the heavy stone steps. The broadcast cut to a sharp courtroom sketch showing Jamal standing before the judge. The anchor continued his report with razor-sharp precision. The supposed financial prodigy and mastermind of the massive offshore fraud ring, Jamal was the first to face the judge, showing absolutely zero remorse for defrauding dozens of elderly pensioners out of their entire life savings. The defendant reportedly launched into a vicious, profanity-laced tirade against the prosecution. Judge Thorne immediately silenced the courtroom and handed down a completely merciless sentence. Jamal has been officially sentenced to 20 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I felt a slow, highly satisfied smile curve the edges of my mouth. 20 years in maximum security. The federal broadcasting system flashed a secondary graphic detailing his specific convictions for aggressive wire fraud, interstate money laundering, and severe RICO violations. Because this is a federal conviction, the anchor clarified his tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. There is no possibility of early parole. Jamal will serve every single day of his 2-decade sentence behind thick concrete walls, entirely permanently separated from the luxury Manhattan lifestyle he violently stole from innocent people. The brilliant fast-talk Wall Street hotshot was completely gone, instantly reduced to a federal inmate number, stamped aggressively onto a scratchy orange jumpsuit. The news broadcast smoothly shifted gears, replacing the sketch of Jamal with a highly unflattering, poorly lit mugshot of my older sister. Courtney looked absolutely horrific. Her signature expensive blonde hair was a chaotic, tangled mess, and her face was heavily swollen from days of frantic, hysterical crying. Next on the federal sentencing docket was his wife, former socialite, and completely disgraced medical practitioner Courtney the anchor reported, perfectly enunciating every single word of her massive downfall. Earlier this month, a federal medical board permanently stripped her of her license after investigators uncovered a massive, highly illegal pill mill operating directly out of her luxury Soho wellness clinic. The news station played a brief audio clip of Courtney weeping violently at the defense table, loudly begging the federal judge for a second chance because she was a supposedly upstanding member of high society. The judge was completely unswayed by her pathetic, manipulative tears. For her direct, undeniable role in trafficking highly addictive and lethal narcotics, as well as her extensive medical billing fraud, Courtney was handed a harsh, mandatory minimum sentence of 7 years in a federal women's correctional facility. The anchor paused for dramatic effect, allowing the absolute gravity of the situation to sink in. Her elite reputation is permanently destroyed. The woman who once loudly paraded her medical degree around exclusive charity galas will now spend the rest of her 30s locked inside a heavily guarded prison block. I picked up a sleek ceramic mug from my desk and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of hot black coffee. The sheer, undeniable poetry of their destruction was better than anything I could have ever planned myself. Courtney had spent my entire childhood aggressively telling me I was a worthless failure who would never amount to anything. She had weaponized her prestigious degree to make me feel like dirt beneath her expensive designer shoes. Now I was the sole executive director of a massive, multi-million-dollar foundation, and she was a convicted drug trafficker who would completely lose her youth rotting inside a tiny, windowless cell. The golden child had permanently lost her shine. The news anchor seamlessly transitioned to the final segment of the broadcast. The screen dissolved into gritty, highly realistic B-roll footage of a sprawling, heavily fortified federal prison complex in upstate New York. Massive coils of razor wire gleamed menacingly in the gray sunlight surrounding rows of bleak, highly depressing concrete housing units. But perhaps the most shocking and deeply pathetic development came from the disgraced matriarch of the family, the anchor announced, his voice taking on a distinct tone of absolute irony. Patricia violently fought the charges for months, desperately trying to manipulate the legal system with her fading country club influence. But when faced with an undeniable mountain of damning federal evidence and a guaranteed 25-year sentence, she finally cracked. She accepted a massive, deeply humiliating plea deal to avoid spending the rest of her natural life behind bars. However, avoiding a maximum security sentence came with a massive, incredibly heavy price. The federal government seized absolutely everything she owned: her luxury vehicles, her secret offshore accounts, and every single piece of expensive jewelry were aggressively liquidated to pay back the victims. Currently, Patricia is serving her reduced federal sentence in a medium security work facility. The anchor detailed the B-roll footage, shifting to show the bleak, highly industrial interior of a massive prison workroom. In order to begin paying back the tens of millions of dollars in court-ordered federal restitution, The former queen of the Manhattan elite is now legally forced to work a grueling minimum wage manual labor job. She spends 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, aggressively scrubbing stains and hauling heavy soaking wet canvas bags inside the blistering hot, highly toxic environment of the federal prison laundry facility. Her delicate, heavily manicured hands are now permanently calloused and blistered. Her massive, lifelong delusion of being a superior, untouchable high society aristocrat has been completely and utterly crushed into dust. The news anchor paused, allowing a brief moment of heavy silence to underscore the absolute destruction of the matriarch before shifting his gaze directly back into the camera lens. However, the most pathetic chapter of this massive federal scandal belongs to the patriarch of the family. The anchor continued, his voice laced with a subtle but undeniable edge of absolute pity. William actively chose self-preservation over his supposed family loyalty. When confronted with the crushing reality of a mandatory 25-year federal sentence, he immediately folded. He signed a comprehensive cooperation agreement with the United States Department of Justice, eagerly taking the witness stand to testify aggressively against his own wife, his daughter, and his son-in-law. He provided prosecutors with the exact locations of their hidden offshore accounts and detailed the daily operations of the illegal medical clinic. His absolute cowardice successfully kept him out of a federal penitentiary, but it cost him every single thing he valued in this world. The federal broadcasting system displayed a final, highly depressing graphic detailing his current financial ruin. Because he was legally married to the primary conspirator and directly benefited from the stolen funds, the government aggressively seized his entire corporate pension, his massive investment portfolios, and all of his personal real estate. The man who once proudly walked the manicured greens of the exclusive Oakwood Country Club is now legally destitute. According to court records, William is currently residing in a highly dilapidated weekly rate motel in rural New Jersey. To survive, the former Wall Street executive is working the graveyard shift as a minimum wage security guard at a desolate, rundown strip mall. He spends his nights shivering in a cheap polyester uniform, patrolling empty parking lots, and dealing with total public humiliation, entirely abandoned by the high society peers he once ruthlessly sacrificed his own morality to impress. I pressed the small black button on my sleek remote control, instantly cutting off the live broadcast. The massive flat-screen television went completely black, immediately returning my expansive corner office to a state of absolute tranquil silence. I set the remote down on my pristine glass desk, feeling an overwhelming wave of profound, permanent closure wash over my entire body. There was no lingering anger left in my chest. There was no residual sadness for the family I had lost, because I never truly had a family to begin with. I simply had a collection of highly toxic, deeply abusive strangers who had actively tried to destroy my life for 32 years. Now those strangers were either locked inside concrete cells scrubbing prison laundry or freezing in cheap security uniforms. The universe had finally balanced the scales with absolute terrifying precision. A sharp, highly professional knock on my heavy oak door immediately pulled me from my thoughts. "Enter," I called out, my voice completely steady and commanding. The heavy door swung open, and my executive assistant, Maya, stepped quickly into the sunlit office. Maya was a razor-sharp, highly efficient woman who managed my entire corporate schedule with lethal accuracy. However, right now, her usually composed expression was replaced by a look of deep, undeniable hesitation. She walked slowly toward my glass desk, holding something incredibly strange in her perfectly manicured hands. It was a cheap, bulky, highly outdated prepaid plastic burner phone. It looked entirely out of place inside my massive multi-million-dollar corporate headquarters. "I am so sorry to interrupt your morning schedule, Director." Maya began, keeping her voice low and highly respectful. "But we just received a highly unusual situation at the primary foundation switchboard. Our reception team intercepted a frantic collect call originating from a highly run-down weekly rate motel in New Jersey." The man on the other end of the line was completely hysterical. He aggressively bypassed our standard corporate screening protocols by loudly sobbing and repeatedly screaming your exact legal name. I leaned back in my plush leather executive chair, my eyes locking onto the cheap plastic phone in her hands. "Let me guess," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "He claimed to be my father." Maya nodded slowly, offering a brief, highly sympathetic look. "Yes, ma'am." He was begging uncontrollably. He told the reception team that he is severely ill, completely broke, and living in absolute squalor. He pleaded for us to patch the call through to your direct line. He swore he just needed one single minute of your time. He said he wanted to finally apologize for everything, that he realizes he made a massive mistake, and that he desperately needs his daughter right now. When reception refused to transfer the unauthorized call, he left a rambling, highly emotional voicemail on this specific burner device we use for external, unverified vendor contacts. Maya extended her arm, gently offering the cheap plastic phone across my pristine glass desk. The small, digital screen was glowing brightly, displaying a single unread voicemail notification. It was a direct, highly desperate lifeline from a broken, ruined man who finally realized he had aggressively discarded the only person in the world who could have actually saved him. He was sitting in a moldy motel room, shivering in a cheap security uniform, desperately hoping that my biological empathy would magically override the decades of severe psychological abuse he had actively allowed to happen. He was hoping the terrified, desperate 22-year-old girl he had ruthlessly thrown out into the snow was still alive somewhere inside my chest. I reached across the desk and took the cheap plastic phone from Maya. I held it in my hand for a brief moment, feeling the flimsy, low-quality plastic pressing against my palm. I did not feel a single microscopic ounce of pity. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to press play and listen to his pathetic, agonizing apologies. I simply felt entirely detached. I stood up slowly from my leather chair, smoothing down the front of my expensive emerald green business suit. I walked calmly across the imported Italian marble floor, heading directly toward the far corner of my massive executive office. Sitting quietly next to a row of heavily secured filing cabinets was a massive industrial-grade paper shredder, specifically designed to instantly destroy thick, highly classified legal documents and heavy plastic credit cards. I held the cheap burner phone directly over the narrow steel opening of the machine. I did not hesitate for a single second. I dropped the plastic phone straight down into the heavy steel blades. The massive machine violently roared to life, instantly pulling the phone into its destructive gears. The sound was incredibly loud and highly aggressive, a chaotic symphony of shattering plastic, grinding metal, and completely destroyed electronics. In less than 3 seconds, the phone was entirely pulverized, reduced to microscopic, unrecognizable pieces of plastic and wire buried deep at the bottom of the waste bin. I turned away from the shredder and walked calmly back to my desk. Maya stood perfectly still, watching me with wide eyes, absolute respect radiating from her posture. She quickly pulled out her digital tablet, ready to resume our busy daily schedule. "Do you need me to block that specific New Jersey number from our corporate switchboard, ma'am?" Maya asked, her voice entirely back to its sharp professional tone. I sat back down in my chair and looked out the massive glass windows at the sprawling, beautifully manicured estate I had built with my own 2 hands. "No," I replied, my voice completely at peace, echoing with the absolute, unbreakable strength of a woman who had finally won the war. "That will not be necessary, Maya. I have no family." The sun began to set over the sprawling Westchester Hills, casting a brilliant golden hour glow across the perfectly manicured lawns of the estate. Exactly 1 year ago, this massive property was a heavily guarded fortress of toxic secrets and stolen pensioner money. Tonight, it was the epicenter of genuine, unadulterated triumph. Hundreds of intricate fairy lights were strung carefully through the branches of the ancient oak trees, illuminating a breathtaking outdoor gala that completely dwarfed any pathetic fake charity event my mother had ever attempted to host. A live string quartet played a modern, elegant symphony from a raised wooden pavilion, their music drifting perfectly over the quiet hum of wealthy, powerful, and entirely legitimate conversations. I stood at the top of the grand marble staircase leading down to the main lawn, taking in the absolute sheer magnitude of the empire I had built. I was not wearing the cheap, oversized hand-me-downs that defined my miserable teenage years. Nor was I hiding in the background trying desperately to avoid the cruel, hypercritical gaze of my parents. Tonight, I was the undisputed center of gravity. I wore a breathtaking, custom-tailored scarlet designer gown that swept elegantly across the stone steps. The deep red silk was a deliberate, highly calculated choice. It was the exact color of the Phoenix Vanguard Foundation logo, a bold, completely unapologetic declaration of absolute power and fierce independence. I wore no heavy, ostentatious jewelry to prove my worth. The undeniable confidence radiating from my posture was the only accessory I needed. As I descended the marble steps, the crowd naturally parted, offering immediate, genuine respect. I did not see a single toxic relative, manipulative country club socialite, or fraudulent medical professional. I was completely surrounded by my chosen family and my fiercely loyal allies. United States Attorney Davis stood near the main champagne fountain looking sharp in a classic black tuxedo. He raised his crystal glass slightly as I approached, offering a firm, highly respectful nod. Next to him were several high-ranking federal agents from the Department of Justice Asset Liquidation Team, the exact same men and women who had helped me systematically dismantle the massive criminal enterprise of my blood relatives. We exchanged warm, genuine smiles bonded permanently by the highly successful absolute destruction of the Wall Street fraud ring. I continued walking through the vibrant crowd, my heart swelling with profound pride as I passed the dozens of brilliant, highly driven women my foundation had actively empowered. Sarah, my lead financial grant coordinator, was aggressively networking with a group of top-tier commercial real estate developers. Next to her was the young single mother from Brooklyn, excitedly showing off the blueprints for her fully funded debt-free commercial bakery to a major venture capitalist. These women were the high school dropouts, the family scapegoats, and the fiercely independent survivors. They were the women who had been viciously told they were completely worthless, just like I was. Now they were heavily funded, highly dangerous corporate titans actively taking over the Manhattan business sector. The soft, elegant chime of a silver spoon tapping against crystal instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. I stepped up onto a raised, beautifully decorated stage at the center of the lawn, stepping directly behind a sleek glass podium. A state-of-the-art microphone caught the sound of my slow, steady breathing as I looked out over the sea of powerful, genuinely supportive faces. The absolute silence was completely electrifying. I did not need a script. The words were burned permanently into my soul, forged in the freezing winter snow 10 years ago when my cowardly father locked me out of my own home. Welcome everyone to the official inaugural gala of the Phoenix Vanguard Foundation. I began, my voice ringing out with crystal clear, undeniable authority. Tonight we are not just celebrating the successful launch of a massive nonprofit organization. We are actively celebrating the absolute destruction of a highly toxic, deeply flawed societal narrative. For decades, the world has aggressively tried to dictate who is allowed to succeed. We were told that without a prestigious family lineage, without a massive trust fund, and without a shiny, expensive college degree, we were destined to be permanent failures. We were ruthlessly cast aside, deeply underestimated, and violently thrown into the absolute darkest corners of society. I paused, letting my piercing gaze sweep across the silent, captivated audience. Some of us were aggressively told by the exact people who were supposed to love us that we were ugly mistakes. I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm, highly resonant tone. We were told that we did not belong, that we would never amount to anything more than a pathetic disappointment. They actively tried to burn us to the ground to keep themselves warm. But they made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. They completely failed to realize that when you burn a strong woman to the ground, you do not destroy her. You simply hand her the exact ashes she needs to build the foundation of an unstoppable, heavily fortified empire. A loud, completely spontaneous wave of applause erupted from the crowd, echoing fiercely against the stone walls of the massive estate. I held up my hand smoothly, bringing the audience back to absolute silence. We did not survive by begging for a seat at their toxic, corrupt tables, I stated firmly, my voice rising with unadulterated power. We survived by aggressively building our own tables. We took their vicious rejections, their horrific betrayals, and their massive criminal failures, and we weaponized them into pure, untouchable financial success. We are the completely undeniable proof that the absolute most devastating, unshakable revenge against toxic people is not anger. It is not shouting matches, and it is not stooping to their pathetic, miserable level. The ultimate revenge is monumental, untouchable, permanent success. I reached over to the side of the glass podium and picked up a tall, perfectly chilled flute of expensive vintage champagne. I held the crystal glass high into the warm evening air, the fairy lights catching the rising golden bubbles. The entire crowd immediately mirrored my movement, hundreds of glasses raised silently toward the darkening sky. To the absolute outcasts, the fearless dropouts, and the women who completely refused to break, I declared, my voice echoing with absolute victorious finality. We did not just survive the fire, we completely owned the flame. The massive crowd erupted into deafening, highly emotional cheers, the sound washing over me like a massive wave of permanent, unbreakable peace. I brought the crystal rim to my lips and took a slow, highly satisfying sip of the sweet champagne. I looked out over the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate that was legally and permanently mine. My toxic criminal family was rotting away in federal prison cells and cheap motel rooms, completely erased from my reality. The ugly, discarded scapegoat had not just survived the freezing winter. She had absolutely conquered the entire world. I lowered the glass, and as the beautiful string music swelled into a vibrant, triumphant crescendo, a slow, highly calculated, completely victorious smile spread permanently across my face. True power does not come from waiting for toxic people to validate your worth. It comes from walking away and building your own empire from the ashes of their rejection. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. When you stop fighting for a seat at a table where you are disrespected, you gain the freedom to build a fortress of your own. Success is the loudest and most unshakable form of revenge. If this story of ultimate payback inspired you, hit that subscribe button. Share this video and comment below how you handled toxic family members today.